The glass stirring rod hit the stone floor before Vane even registered the sound outside. It shattered cleanly across the tile, scattering fragments between the legs of his workbench. He stood there for half a second watching the shards settle, because a stirring rod like that, borosilicate, 2-finger thick, sourced from the glassworks in Miral before they closed, was not something you replaced on a disgraced alchemist's salary. Then the second sound came, not a crack, not a snap, a full, grinding collapse of wood and iron against wet earth, followed by the low, wet groan of something very heavy being swallowed by something that didn't intend to give it back. Vane moved to the window. The Blackwater swamp began exactly 40 paces from his laboratory door. Or, rather, it had always been there, but tonight it had decided to come closer. A slaver's prison wagon had left the road. The rear axle was already gone, sunk past the wheel hub, and the horses were gone too. Cut loose or bolted, he couldn't tell. The wagon itself was tilted at a sharp angle, listing toward the dark water like a man too tired to keep standing. The lantern mounted above the driver's box was still lit. It swayed with the slow, patient movement of something being dragged under. In the orange circle of that swaying light, Vane could see the cage. He pulled on his coat without looking at what he was doing. His hands moved across the bandolier on the workbench by memory, fingers reading the vials by shape the way a blind man reads walls. 12 slots, 10 occupied. He buckled it across his chest, grabbed his staff from the corner, and went outside. The cold hit him immediately. Not the dry cold of winter, but the wet kind. The kind that gets into the seams of your coat and sits there. The path from his door to the swamp's edge was compacted gravel, safe enough. But the moment his left boot crossed the boundary where the gravel ended and the dark ground began, he understood the problem. The mud did not hold him. It took his boot past the ankle in one smooth pull, the way water takes a stone. He yanked his foot free, heard the sucking pop of it, and planted his staff for balance. Then he took another step, and the same thing happened. By the time he'd covered 10 paces, his boots were soaked through, and the mud was above his shins. He kept moving. The staff helped. It gave him something to lean into, something to test the ground with before committing his weight. His bad eye was useless in this light, which meant his field of vision was half what it should have been, and his depth perception was off. He misjudged a route and stumbled, caught himself, kept going. The wagon was still sinking. Slowly but steadily, the way the Blackwater always worked. Not in a rush, just persistent. Patient, the way bad things tend to be. He got close enough to see the cage properly, and he stopped for a moment. It was deep mine iron. He recognized the construction. Thick, rectangular bars, welded at stress points rather than joined, with a plate steel floor instead of the woven base used on ordinary slave cages. That kind of cage cost more than Vane earned in a year. The slavers who used them were not transporting field workers or debtors. Deep mine iron was built for one specific category: berserker-class slaves. Gladiators. Orc fighters who had demonstrated the capacity to tear through standard restraints as if they were dry rope. The figure inside confirmed it. She was sitting. That was the first thing he noticed, and it struck him as strange. Not standing, not pressing herself against the bars, not screaming. Sitting, back straight, arms resting on her knees, iron collar around her throat attached by a short chain to the rear wall of the cage. She was watching the water rise around her with the expression of someone who had already made their calculations and arrived at an answer they didn't like. The water was at her waist. The cage had another 4, maybe 5 minutes before the mud took it to a depth that made the door irrelevant. Vane reached the cage side and planted his staff in the mud to keep from going under himself. The woman inside didn't look at him immediately. Her eyes moved to him the way a soldier's eyes move to an unfamiliar sound, assessing, not panicking. She was massive, even seated. Her shoulders were broad, and her arms were built from years of something far more serious than labor. There were old marks on her forearms, pale against green-gray skin, the kind that come from blocked blades rather than from whips. The iron collar at her throat was thick enough that Vane's acid would need a full vial to compromise it, maybe more, and the chain attached to it was anchored to a bolt set in a plate steel wall. The lock on the door was standard slaver grade. He could manage the lock. The water was rising. He didn't have time to stand and think about the rest. He uncorked the first vial from the left row of his bandolier and leaned toward the lock. Somewhere behind him, back in the darkness of the tree line, a dog barked once, then went quiet. The silence after it was worse than the sound. The lock was a 4-bolt barrel design, iron cast, coated in swamp rust that had probably been there longer than the current owner. Vane knew the type. Standard issue for mid-tier slaving outfits operating outside city jurisdiction. Not cheap, but not quality either. The kind of hardware bought in bulk from foundries that didn't ask questions. Under normal conditions, in his laboratory, with proper ventilation and a steady surface, he could have dissolved it in under a minute. These were not normal conditions. He uncorked the vial with his teeth, holding his staff under one arm to keep from sinking, and poured the concentrated acid directly onto the lock mechanism. The green liquid hit iron and immediately began its work. A soft, aggressive hiss, the kind of sound that reminds you why you don't touch the stuff with bare skin. The chemical reaction was fast and unpleasant. A cloud of white vapor bloomed upward from the dissolving metal, thick and acrid. The kind of smoke that doesn't just sting, it finds the weakest point in your face and commits to it. For Vane, that point was his left eye. The damaged eye watered instantly, the lid clenching shut on its own. He turned his face sideways and coughed, a hard, involuntary cough that bent him at the waist and nearly cost him his footing in the mud. His staff sank another 2 inches. He straightened, blinked the good eye clear, and kept the vial tipped against the lock, letting the last drops work into the bolt housing. The hissing continued. The white cloud drifted sideways across the cage bars and into the interior. That was when she spoke. "If you burn my skin, human," the orc said, her voice low and deliberate, carrying the flat, unhurried weight of someone who had made this kind of statement before and meant it every time. "I will bite your throat out." Vane didn't look up from the lock. "The smoke drifts east," he said. "Lean west." A pause, then the creak of the chain as she shifted her weight. He kept his eyes on the mechanism. The acid had compromised the outer casing. He could see the barrel softening at the seam, the iron going dark and porous where the compound was eating through. Another 30 seconds. He counted them by his own heartbeat, which was faster than he would have liked, partly from the cold water soaking through his coat to his chest, and partly from the dog bark he'd heard 60 seconds ago, which had not been followed by a second bark, which was somehow worse. The lock gave with a dull, wet crack. Not a clean snap, but a dissolving, the way things fail when they've been chemically compromised rather than forced. The bolt housing sagged and separated. Vane grabbed the door bar with his free hand and pulled. It didn't move. The mud had the lower hinge. He pulled harder, planting his boot against the cage frame for leverage, and felt the door shift. 1 inch, 2, grinding against the suction of the swamp floor beneath it. The water was at his own knees now. He registered that fact without reacting to it. The water was at the orc's shoulders. That was the number that mattered. He got the door open 8 inches, then 12. Then the mud released it all at once, and the door swung wide, the momentum nearly pulling him off his feet. She moved immediately. Not scrambling, not splashing. She turned, planted one hand on the cage floor, and drove her shoulder into the door frame to widen it further, the iron bar of the frame bending slightly under the force. She was through in 2 seconds, water streaming from her clothing, the chain of her collar going taut behind her, still anchored to the cage wall. She reached the end of its length and stopped, standing in chest-deep water, one hand raised toward her throat. Vane was already reading the second vial from his bandolier. Different compound, not acid, but a contact solvent, weaker concentration, safer for work near skin. He moved toward the chain anchor point on the cage wall instead of the collar itself, which was the correct decision, and he made it quickly enough that she hadn't yet had time to form a full opinion about him. He poured the solvent onto the anchor bolt. It worked slower than the lock acid. He waited, standing in water that was now threatening the lower edge of his bandolier, watching the bolt housing lose its integrity one layer at a time. She stood beside the cage in the dark water and said nothing. He could feel her watching him in the way that people watch things they haven't decided about yet. Not hostile, but not settled either. The chain fell away from the wall with a soft splash. She was free of the cage. The collar and its short length of dangling chain were still at her throat, but that was a problem for solid ground. Vane turned toward the bank and immediately lost his footing. His left boot found nothing. A submerged drop in the swamp floor, a root gap, something, and he went down sideways, face first into the dark water. The cold was immediate and total, the kind that stops the breath before the mind catches up. His bandolier dragged at him. 12 slots, 10 vials, even mostly empty. The glass and metal across his chest was enough to pull a man of his build straight down in soft-bottomed water. He got his hands under him, found no purchase, and came up coughing, one eye blinded by the black water, the other blinded by his own wet hair. Something grabbed the back of his coat, one hand. It lifted him out of the water with the patient, unhurried force of something that was not straining to do it. She set him down on the sloped bank above the waterline and released him the moment his boots found ground. No ceremony, no dramatics. He stood there for a moment, dripping, coughing the swamp water out of his chest, and looked back at the cage. It was down to the roof bars now. In another 2 minutes, the lantern above the driver's box would go under, and there would be no light at all. She was standing 2 paces away, water streaming from the ends of her dark hair, the dangling chain at her collar catching the last of the lantern light. She'd pulled a bar from the cage as she left. He hadn't seen it happen, but she was holding it now, a length of rusted deep-mine iron as long as his forearm and twice as thick. She hadn't asked permission to take it. It hadn't occurred to her to ask, and it hadn't needed to. She looked at him, not the way you look at someone you've decided to trust. The way you look at a door you're trying to determine the weight of. From the tree line to the north, low and resonant and entirely too close, came the sound of a hunting horn. The horn didn't repeat. One long note, then silence. The kind of silence that meant someone had blown it for coordination, not alarm. They knew where the wagon went down. They were already moving. Vane didn't explain any of this out loud. He turned east and started moving. The bank above the waterline was marginally better than the open swamp. Compacted root mat instead of loose mud, which meant his boots sank 2 inches instead of 6. He used his staff in short, testing jabs ahead of each step, reading the ground before committing to it. His coat was soaked through and heavy, his bandolier dripping steadily onto the root mat with a sound that irritated him more than it should have. 2 of his vials had taken water around the cork seals when he went under. He didn't know yet if that had compromised the compounds inside. He made a note to check at the first opportunity and kept moving. She followed without being asked. He heard her behind him, not because she was loud, but because her weight on the root mat produced a different sound than his. Lower register, more compression, the soft crack of roots that held under his 160 pounds, bending further under hers. She moved carefully for someone her size, he noticed. Not cautiously, the way a nervous person moves, but with the considered, deliberate placement of someone trained to read terrain. Pit fighters who lasted more than a season learned to move like that. The ones who didn't learn it didn't last. They covered 40 paces east before she spoke. "Where?" she said. Not a question with a rising tone, a statement demanding completion. "Free territories," Vane said. "Northeast edge of the swamp. 3 days, maybe 2 if the paths hold." "You know the paths." "I know some of them." He tested a patch of ground, found it soft, adjusted 2 steps right. "I've been living next to this swamp for 4 years. I've mapped the stable routes, most of them." A pause behind him. "Most? The swamp shifts. Nothing in here is permanent." He moved forward. "Stay on the route mat and step where I step. Don't test the dark patches. The water there is deep and the mud underneath is soft. If you go in past the waist, don't pull upward. Go horizontal, distribute your weight, and I'll find something for you to grab." Another pause, longer this time. "You have done that before," she said. "Pulled someone out of the mud?" "Explained how to be pulled out of the mud." He didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. He had explained it to himself 4 years ago, in the first month of living out here, before he'd understood that the Blackwater didn't behave like ordinary wetland. He'd gone in up to his hip on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 40 minutes working himself out of it by increments while his tea went cold on the laboratory step. After that, he'd made a map. The bioluminescent spore pods began appearing around the 100-pace mark. They grew low to the ground, clustered around submerged root systems, glowing with a cold blue-green light that was almost beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. Vane gave the first cluster a wide berth, guiding them in an arc around its edge. She noticed the detour. "Those," she said, "spore pods. If the casing breaks, stepped on, disturbed, knocked, they release. The dust is a contact irritant to the lungs. You'll cough for 2 days, and your eyes will swell shut." He moved around the arc and returned to the main line. "They're useful if you need to slow someone down. Less useful if you're the one being slowed." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the pods as they passed. "You know many ways to slow people down." "It's a professional interest." She made a sound that wasn't quite a response. A low exhale through the nose, the kind that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. He didn't turn to look. Behind them, from the direction of the sunken wagon, came the sound he'd been waiting for. The first hound. Not a bark this time, but a sustained, working note, a tracking call. The dog had found the scent at the water's edge, which meant they had, at best, 20 minutes before the pack caught the line through the swamp. Hounds bred for slaver work were not ordinary dogs. They were crossed with swamp stock breeds for water tolerance and fed on blood-scented grain from puppyhood to fix their drives. They didn't lose a trail. They just ran it at whatever speed the terrain allowed. Vane adjusted his pace. The route mat narrowed ahead, pinching between 2 sections of open water, and he slowed to single file, testing each step twice. She closed the gap between them. Up close, without the panic of the cage in the water, he was more aware of the specific details he hadn't had time to process before. The iron collar still at her throat, trailing its length of chain with a broken end where the anchor bolt had separated. The chain swayed as she moved and caught the spore pod light in dull flickers. The whip marks he'd half seen in the cage light were visible even now on the backs of her forearms. Not random, those. Patterned. Deliberate. The kind left by the bladed training whips used in underground pit circuits to teach fighters to block cleanly or pay in skin. She'd blocked a great deal and paid in skin anyway, and kept going. The route mat widened again, and Vane stepped up his pace. They were 40 minutes into the swamp when the ground gave way. Not catastrophically, not a full collapse. A soft patch that hadn't been soft the last time he'd walked this route, possibly shifted by recent rain or by the disturbance of the wagon going down nearby. His left foot went through the mat to mid-shin, and the root structure around it began to follow, the whole patch going liquid under compression. He yanked back, which was wrong. He knew it was wrong the moment he did it, and the suction held. He planted his staff. The staff sank. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the mud decided he was committed. Her hand closed around the back of his collar. Not the gentle lift from the water, but a proper grip. 2 fingers hooked into the fabric at the nape, and she pulled him backward out of the ground with one smooth motion. His boot came free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. She set him on solid root mat 2 steps back from the soft patch and released him. He stood still for a moment, breathing. She moved past him without a word and tested the ground to the left with one end of her iron bar, pressing it down in a slow, methodical line until she found where the solid root mat resumed. She pressed the bar into the ground at that point, marking it, then looked back at him. The chain at her collar caught the blue-green light. "Left," she said. He went left. The tracking horn sounded again behind them, closer now, and this time it was answered by a second horn to the south. They were being flanked. 2 horns meant 2 teams. Vane worked that out in the first 10 seconds after the second note faded, and the arithmetic was not encouraging. A single slaver unit running a track would spread its hounds in a fan ahead of the handlers. Wide search pattern, designed to locate and bay rather than close. 2 units converging from different angles meant a pincer. They weren't searching anymore. They had a fix on the direction, and they were compressing the available ground. He didn't say any of this. He just moved faster. The spore pods were thicker here, clustering along both sides of the viable path in low, pulsing rows that turned the mist above them a faint, cold green. The mist itself was thinner than it had been at the bank. Out here, 40 minutes deep into the swamp, the fog moved differently, channeled by the root systems and the pockets of standing water into drifting columns rather than a solid bank. It caught the pod light and scattered it, so the whole corridor of passable ground glowed in shifting patches of blue and green and dark. It would have been something to look at, under other circumstances. Vane tested the path 3 steps at a time, working his staff in short, precise jabs to the left and right of the center line before each advance. The technique was his own, developed over 4 years of walking these routes with no one to pull him out if he misjudged. Short jab left, short jab right. Weight forward onto the tested ground. Repeat. It was slow. In open terrain, he covered ground quickly enough. Here, in the dark, with the paths shifting and the hounds behind him, it felt like walking through cold tar. She matched his pace exactly. He noticed it without comment. She could have moved faster. Her stride was longer than his, and her weight, counterintuitively, gave her better purchase on the root mat than his lighter frame did, because she compressed it into stability rather than skating across the surface. But she stayed 2 steps behind him and put her feet where he put his, and she did it without being told. That was not instinct. That was discipline. The kind built from years of reading a partner's movements in tight spaces, a cage, a pit, a corridor of fighters waiting for their turn. The path forked. 2 viable lines of root mat splitting around a wide section of open black water. Left fork ran northwest, which was wrong, deeper into the swamp, away from the free territories. Right fork ran northeast, which was correct, but narrowed to single-file width within 20 paces, and then disappeared behind a stand of mangrove root that blocked his sight line entirely. He'd walked the right fork twice before, both times in daylight, both times alone, which meant he hadn't needed to account for what the combined weight of two people would do to the narrowed section. He took the right fork. The mangroves closed around them quickly. The root systems here grew in dense, overlapping arches, some of them chest-high on Vane, which meant they reached her mid-torso, and she moved through them with her head lowered and her shoulders turned sideways to fit the gaps. The iron bar she carried was a problem. It caught on the arches repeatedly, and each time she had to pause, rotate the bar to a different angle, and press forward. She did this without frustration, with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to adapting equipment to terrain. But it cost them seconds, and seconds were what they didn't have. Vane heard the first hound clearly now. Not a tracking note, a working sound, the low, wet snuffling of a dog with its nose down, moving at pace. Close enough that he could distinguish it from the ambient noise of the swamp. 50 yards, maybe less. Moving northeast, which meant it was already on their line. He stopped and crouched. The spore pod cluster to his immediate right was large. A dozen casings, each the size of his fist, glowing in a dense knot around the base of a mangrove root. He studied the spacing. The cluster sat exactly between the two viable ground lines, which meant any large animal moving fast on the track would hit it. A dog, moving with its nose down, not watching the ground, would hit it at full stride. He looked at the root mat carefully, tracing the structural line. There was a section 3 paces ahead where the roots braided together into a raised ridge, stable enough for foot traffic, but with open water on both sides. If the hound was running the track, it would come through this corridor, hit the ridge, veer left toward the solid ground, and land directly in the spore cluster. Vane stood up and kept moving. He did not touch the cluster. She passed it 2 steps behind him, close enough that the chain at her collar swung within an arm's length of the outermost pod. She moved her shoulder back slightly as she passed it. She'd understood what it was. He hadn't needed to explain. They came through the mangrove stand into a wider section of path, and Vane let himself breathe again. The path here was better. Older root mat, compressed by years of animal traffic, dark and firm underfoot. The spore pods thinned out. The mist thinned with them. Overhead, through a gap in the canopy, he could see cloud-diffused starlight, which gave just enough ambient light that his good eye could read the terrain without relying entirely on the staff. He checked his bandolier. The 2 vials he'd flagged for water damage were the 3rd and 7th slots, a freezing compound and a contact accelerant. He uncorked the 3rd vial carefully and tilted it, checking the consistency of the liquid inside. Still uniform, no separation. The cork had held. He recorked it and checked the 7th. Same result. He exhaled and let the tension out of his shoulders. "You count them," she said. Behind him, close enough that he heard her clearly without effort. "Every time you stop." "I count what I have left," he said. "It's relevant." "How many?" 10. 2 are uncertain. He recorked the 7th and tucked it back. "I had 12 this morning. I used 2 on the cage." She was quiet for a moment. "And when they are gone?" He tested the ground ahead and moved forward. "Then I use the staff." Another silence. Then, from behind him, a sound he didn't immediately categorize. Not quite a breath, not quite a word. He glanced back. Her expression hadn't changed, the same flat, assessing look she'd had since the moment she first saw him at the cage. But there was something in the set of her jaw that might, in different light, have been called dry. "A wooden stick," she said. "It's a very good stick." She said nothing, but she didn't argue either. Behind them, from the mangrove corridor, came a sharp yelp, sudden, cut off, and then a prolonged, wet coughing. The hound had found the spore cluster. The tracking note it had been running went silent. In the distance, the handler's horn blew twice in quick succession, a recall signal, urgent. They'd lost the dog to the dust. Vane kept moving northeast. The path held. But the southern horn was still active, and it was closer than it had been. The southern horn blew 3 times in a row, short and clipped. That was a close signal. Handlers telling each other they were within visual range of their target zone. Vane knew the call patterns because 4 years ago, before the laboratory, before the Blackwater, he'd spent 8 months contracted to a border garrison that used the same horn codes for tracking deserters. He hadn't enjoyed the work. He'd learned the signals anyway. 3 short blasts meant they were guessing his direction from the horn gap. They didn't have a visual yet. The spore pods had bought them perhaps 10 minutes before the southern unit reoriented and picked up the trail again. He intended to use all 10 of them. The path northeast had widened into a relatively stable corridor, 20 paces of firm root mat bracketed by open water on both sides. The surface dark and compacted enough that they could move at something close to a normal walking pace without testing every step. Vane pushed the pace as hard as he dared, staff tucked under his arm now instead of probing ahead, relying on the ambient starlight and the faint residual glow of distant spore pods to read the ground. His bad eye was useless in this light, and he'd stopped accounting for it 20 minutes ago. He moved with his head turned slightly right, putting his working eye forward, which gave him a narrow field of view, but a clear one. She was keeping pace behind him without difficulty. The chain at her collar had stopped swaying. She'd looped the loose end around her hand twice to keep it from catching on the undergrowth. Small adaptation, made quickly, without comment. He noticed these things because they were useful to know. The reeds hit them without warning. The path didn't end. It simply filled. A dense stand of black marsh reeds, 6 feet tall, growing directly across the corridor in a wall that his staff couldn't have anticipated because the bases were submerged. The reeds were quiet in the still air, no wind, no movement. And then, from inside them, 4 feet off the ground and coming fast, a wet, crashing impact as something large launched itself out of the dark. The hound hit the root mat between them and the reed wall. It was bigger than an ordinary tracking dog. Slaver-bred swamp stock. He'd heard of the type, but hadn't seen one up close. Heavy through the chest, short-coated, with the wide, flat skull of a dog bred for grip rather than speed. Its legs were soaked to the shoulder from the reeds. It had its mouth open and was breathing in rapid pulls, reading the air, not the ground. It had overshot their scent line and circled back, which meant it had been working off sound rather than smell for the last 30 seconds. It landed, scrabbled for purchase on the root mat, and turned its head toward Vane. He was already moving, not away, toward his bandolier. Left hand across his chest, 3rd slot, the freezing compound. His fingers found the vial by shape, wider than the acid, lighter than the accelerant. He uncorked it with his palm, not his teeth, because his teeth were occupied with holding his breath while he worked. The dog gathered itself for the lunge. Vane threw the vial at the water to the left of the hound's front legs. He aimed for the water, not the animal. The freezing compound worked on liquid, dropped it 20 degrees in 2 seconds, and formed a surface crust of ice that was brittle but immediate. The vial hit the water at the root mat's edge and shattered. The reaction was fast and loud, a sharp cracking as the water hardened and the ice sheet expanded outward, catching the root mat edge and the mud beneath it and the lower half of the hound's left foreleg in the same spreading radius. The dog lurched sideways and stopped. Its leg was in the ice to the ankle. It pulled and the ice cracked but held. Deep mine mud beneath the ice gave it an anchor that the animal's mass couldn't overcome in a single pull. It dropped its head and bit at the ice casing. It bit hard. The compound splashed back onto Vane's coat sleeve when the vial broke. He felt it immediately. a biting cold that stiffened the fabric and worked through to his forearm in the space of 2 heartbeats. Not dangerous, not on the surface of his coat, but his right arm from elbow to wrist went rigid with it, the muscles seizing under the cold, the way muscle does when temperature drops too fast. And for a full 3 seconds, his hand didn't respond to what he was telling it to do. She was already moving. He heard the iron bar before he saw it, the low, fast whistle of something dense cutting air. She came past him on his left, 2 strides, the bar raised across her body and then driven downward in a flat, horizontal arc. Not a swing, a drive. The technique of someone who had learned to hit targets that were braced and expecting impact, because in a pit, the other fighter was always braced and expecting it. The bar connected with the hound's skull just above the ear, and the sound it made was solid and final. The dog dropped. The ice held its leg for another second, then cracked under the shift of weight. She stood over the animal with the bar at her side, breathing normally. Not fast, not slow. The chain at her collar swayed once and settled. She looked at the dog the way a carpenter looks at a nail they've just driven flush. Task complete, attention already moving to the next thing. Then she looked at Vane's right arm. He was working the fingers, trying to get the cold out of the muscle. The coat was stiff from elbow to cuff, the fabric crackling slightly when he flexed his arm. He had full movement back within 30 seconds. The compound was surface cold, not penetrating. But those 30 seconds were visible, and she watched them. "Your hands," she said. "They're fine." She looked at the stiff coat sleeve. "They are not fine." "They will be fine," he said, "in a minute." He flexed the fingers twice more, felt the blood return in a rush of pins and needles, and nodded. "There. Fine." She watched him for a moment longer. Not with concern, exactly. More with the particular attention of someone recalculating a variable they'd previously estimated. He was, from her perspective, a man who had just frozen his own arm while trying to freeze a dog, who could barely walk in a straight line in soft mud, and who was apparently their primary means of getting through the swamp alive. He understood why she was recalculating. He chose not to address it directly. "The reeds," he said. "We need to go through them." She looked at the wall of black reeds. Then she stepped past him, lowered her shoulder, and walked into them at full stride. They parted. Not easily. The stalks were dense, and their roots were interlocked below the waterline, and the resistance was real. But she moved through the wall in a straight line, the bar held across her chest to widen the gap, and the reeds bent and snapped and let her through because they had no better option. By the time Vane followed 3 steps behind, there was a corridor of broken stalks wide enough that he could walk it without the reeds touching his bandolier. The path on the other side was clear. Northeast, still firm, the route mat stretching ahead into the dark with no obstacles visible. Behind them, somewhere in the middle distance, the southern horn blew once, acknowledging the silence where the hound's working note had been. Vane rolled his right arm once, feeling the last stiffness leave his shoulder, and kept walking. 1 vial spent, 9 remaining, 2 uncertain. The arithmetic of it settled in his chest the way cold water does, slowly and all at once. They walked for another 2 hours before Vane called a halt, not because the path gave out. It held, mostly, with 2 short detours around soft ground that he caught early enough to avoid. Not because the horns had gotten closer. They'd fallen behind somewhere in the last 40 minutes, the southern unit apparently having lost the track at the reed stand and not yet reacquired it. He called the halt because his legs were failing in the specific, incremental way that wet cold produces. Not a sudden weakness, but a steady reduction, each step requiring slightly more decision than the one before it, until walking became a matter of will rather than mechanics. He'd been in the Blackwater's water twice tonight. His core temperature was doing its best and losing. He didn't announce any of this. He stopped walking, scanned the immediate terrain, and found what he was looking for within 20 paces. A hollow mangrove root, large enough in diameter that a man could sit inside the curve of it with his knees up. The root itself was old. Decades of growth had lifted the main trunk 4 feet off the ground, leaving a dry cavity beneath it where the wood arched up from the mud. The floor of the hollow was compacted dry soil, elevated enough above the waterline that it hadn't flooded. He checked it with his staff, found it sound, and crouched inside. She stood outside the hollow and looked at it. "We stop here," Vane said. She looked at the hollow, then at the darkness around them. "The handlers are behind us." Moving on foot in the dark in this swamp without a scent trail takes time. He was already pulling flint and steel from the inner pocket of his coat. "We need 4 hours. We won't get 4. We'll take 2. She remained standing outside for a moment, the instinct of someone for whom stopping had always meant being caught or being hit, for whom rest was a vulnerability rather than a recovery. He'd seen it before, in garrison soldiers who'd been in the field too long. The body knew it needed rest. The training said rest was how you died. The two things argued with each other until one of them won. She sat down outside the hollow, back against the root, facing the direction they'd come from. Close enough to the hollow that she was within the dry zone, but not inside it, not quite willing to be that enclosed. He didn't comment on it. The flint struck steel 3 times before a spark caught in the small nest of dry bark he'd scraped from the inner surface of the mangrove root. The wood was old and very dry, and the flame took hold with almost no encouragement, burning small and clean with almost no smoke. Exactly what he needed. He built it to the size of his cupped hands and stopped there. A fire big enough to warm by was also big enough to show through the canopy. The fire he built was big enough to function. From the outer pocket of his coat, he produced a battered tin cup and a folded paper packet of dried marsh reeds, the particular variety that grew along the northeast quadrant of the Blackwater, which he'd learned in his first year here were not toxic and produced, when boiled, something that was not tea, but was warm and faintly bitter and contained nothing that would hurt you. He'd packed them out of habit that morning, the way he always packed them when he was going to be outside past sunset. He filled the cup from a section of standing water he'd collected in a stoppered flask during the walk, tested water from a source he knew, and balanced it on 2 stones above the flame. His hands were shaking, not violently, a fine, persistent tremor that he could suppress if he concentrated, but the moment he stopped concentrating, it returned. The freezing compound on his sleeve had been surface cold, as he'd told her, but 2 immersions in the Blackwater in one night had lowered his baseline in a way that fine motor function reflected before anything else did. He was aware of it. He managed it. He reached for the tin cup to check the water temperature and knocked it sideways off the stones. The cup hit the dry soil, and the water, not yet boiling, not yet hot, but warmer than ambient, splashed across the back of his right hand and soaked into the cuff of his coat. He picked the cup up, refilled it from the flask, replaced it on the stones, and did not swear out loud, which cost him something. The back of his hand was pink. Not burned, just warm and damp, and adding to the general inventory of indignities the evening had produced. She was watching him. He didn't look up. "It's fine." "You said that about your arm." And it was fine. He adjusted the 2 stones so the cup sat more stably. "This is also fine." She was quiet for a moment. The fire was small, but it threw enough light that he could see the edge of her profile, the line of her jaw, the angle where the iron collar sat against her neck. The collar had rubbed the skin there, he noticed. Not broken it, but the edge of the metal had been in contact with the same patch of skin for long enough that the area was visibly irritated, darkening at the margins in the way skin does under sustained pressure. "The collar," he said. "I can remove it when I've restocked the acid vials at the first cache point." She said nothing for a moment. "You have a cache?" "Two. Northeast path, one at the midpoint, and one near the swamp's edge." He watched the water in the cup begin to show the first small movement of pre-boil. "I was planning to replenish my supplies this week anyway. The timing is inconvenient, but not catastrophic." She looked at him with the particular expression of someone encountering a fact that doesn't fit the category they'd placed it in. He had the sense she'd built a working model of him in the hours since the cage, fragile, useful, probably temporary, and details like pre-stocked supply caches were forcing her to revise it, which she was doing reluctantly. "You planned to walk the swamp," she said. "I walk it regularly. For materials." He added the dried marsh reeds to the now simmering water and watched the color change, pale brown seeping into the water from the compressed stalks. "The northeastern edge has blue moss that I use for a wound salve. Certain root compounds for accelerant base. It's a supply run. Twice a year. Alone. I live alone." She absorbed this. The fire snapped once, a pocket of air in the dry wood releasing, and she didn't flinch at the sound, but her hand moved 1 inch toward the iron bar lying across her knees before it stopped. Reflex, not response. The gap between those two things was where her self-control lived, and it was well maintained. "How long?" she said. "In the swamp?" "Alone." He considered the question, which was more specific than it sounded. 11 years, he said, more or less. She looked at him. Not with pity. The Orc equivalent of that expression was something different, he suspected, but with a kind of flat recognition, the way one person who knows a particular weight identifies it in another person's posture. The water was ready. He poured it carefully into the cup, suppressing the tremor in his hand by gripping the flask with both, and held the cup toward her. She looked at it, then at him. The fire was between them, small and steady, and the swamp was quiet except for the distant, ordinary sounds of water and wind in the canopy. No horns, no hounds. She took the cup. He watched her close both hands around it. Her hands were nearly twice the width of his, the knuckles scarred in the specific pattern left by years of bare fist contact against hard surfaces, and hold it without drinking for a moment, feeling the warmth through her palms. Something in her shoulders changed. Not much. The kind of change that requires knowing what the before looked like to notice the after. She drank. He folded his arms inside his coat, conserving heat, and listened to the swamp, and waited for the horns. They didn't come. Not yet. The fire burned down by a quarter, and the mist moved through the canopy overhead in slow, cold columns, and the night pressed in around the small circle of warmth with its full weight. Somewhere to the south, a hound gave one flat, exploratory bark, then went quiet again. He gave it 10 minutes. 15. Then he reached for the flint. The fire was down to coals by the time she made the sound. Not a word. A short, involuntary exhale through the nose. The kind of sound a person makes when something hurts and they've decided not to say so. He'd heard it twice before in the last 20 minutes, dismissed it the first time, filed it the second, and now on the third occurrence, he looked up from the vial he'd been resealing. She was sitting with her back straight and her eyes forward, the iron bar across her knees, both hands flat on her thighs. Her jaw was set. Her posture was the posture of someone sitting a formal inspection, deliberate, controlled, presenting nothing. But her right shoulder was elevated slightly higher than her left, and her head had a barely perceptible forward tilt, as if she was unconsciously trying to move away from something at the back of her neck. He set the vial down. "Turn around," he said. She looked at him. "There's something on your neck," he said. "Back of it, below the collar line. Turn around." She didn't move for a moment. The coals gave a low pulse of orange light that caught the chain at her collar and threw its shadow long across the dry soil. In the quiet, the swamp made its ordinary sounds. Water shifting, something small moving through undergrowth 30 paces out, the slow tick of cooling wood in the mangrove root above them. "What kind of something?" she said. "Blackwater leech." He kept his voice even. "They're common on the northeast routes after dark. They attach at the hairline or under collar edges, anywhere the skin is thin and the blood runs close to the surface." He paused. "You've been feeling it for a while." Not a question. She recognized that and didn't treat it like one. The problem with blackwater leeches was not the feeding itself. That was unpleasant but manageable. The problem was removal. The species native to this section of the swamp had evolved a feeding apparatus with two components: the outer ring, which anchored, and the inner structure, which was a set of recurved microteeth that detached from the body under tensile stress. Pull the leech directly, and the outer ring came away with the body while the inner teeth stayed in the wound, breaking off at the surface and migrating inward along the bloodstream. The toxin they carried wasn't immediately lethal, but it accumulated in nerve tissue and expressed as progressive muscular paralysis over 18 to 36 hours, starting at the extremities. He'd seen it happen to a swamp rat 2 years ago. The rat had made it 40 feet from the point of attachment before its hind legs stopped working. He opened the outer pocket of his bandolier case and removed the small roll of instruments he kept there. Not chemical equipment, but physical. A pair of silver-tipped tweezers, a probe the diameter of a wire, a folded square of cloth for sterilization. The silver mattered. Steel tools carried a galvanic charge that caused leech musculature to contract during extraction, which increased the risk of tooth separation. Silver was neutral. He sterilized the tweezers in what remained of the heated water, shook them dry, and waited. She hadn't moved. "I need to be close to your spine," he said, "and I need my hands to be still. I'll tell you before I make contact." He looked at her. "If you move during extraction, the teeth separate. I can't fix that in the field." She held his gaze for a long moment. The firelight caught her eyes, dark with the specific density of someone who had learned to give away as little as possible through expression, because expression had been used against her at some point in the past, and she'd stopped offering it freely. Then she reached into the inner fold of her clothing and removed a piece of cloth. It was small, palm-sized, roughly square, folded twice. Dry, which in the context of a night spent wading through the Blackwater made it the most valuable piece of fabric she owned. She held it toward him, not extended with the open gesture of offering, but held out flat, the way you hand someone a tool. Functional transaction, no ceremony. He took it. He understood what it meant. In practical terms, she was giving him better material for the procedure than the damp cloth he'd have used. In other terms, she was handing him the last dry thing she had, while putting her back to him within reach of her neck and her spine, and telling him not to move. There were fighters in garrison cells who wouldn't have done that for someone they'd known a year. He folded her cloth over his left palm and dried the tweezers again. "Turning now," he said. She turned, her back to him, knees forward, hands on her thighs. The iron collar sat high on her neck. The rubbed skin at its lower edge was more visible from this angle, the irritation forming a thin band following the metal's contour. Below that, at the point where the collar's chain attachment sat at the back, he could see the leech. It was attached at the hairline, partially hidden under the collar's lower edge, which was why it had gone unnoticed, and which meant it had been there since at minimum the swamp entry, possibly since the cage. Small enough that it was easy to miss in poor light. Dark brown, flat, maybe 3 centimeters in contracted length. Already engorged enough to have changed color at the edges. It had been feeding for hours. He moved in close. The proximity was unavoidable. To work at the hairline with precision instruments in low light, he needed to be within a forearm's length. He could smell the swamp on her still, the cold water and iron smell of the Blackwater mud, and underneath it something else. Smoke, old leather, the specific dry smell of skin that has spent years in underground spaces with limited ventilation. The fighting pits smelled like that. He'd been in one once, for entirely professional reasons, and the smell had stayed with him. He positioned the tweezers. His hands were still shaking. The fine tremor was still present, less than before, the 2 hours of rest and the warm water having brought his baseline up, but present. He was aware of it in the same way he was aware of his bad eye, as a fixed variable to be accounted for, not lamented. He had learned over years of working with unstable chemical compounds that the way to manage an imprecise instrument was to reduce the margin of error in everything else. Steady surface, correct angle, slow approach. He took one breath and held it. His hands went still. Not permanently. The tremor would return the moment he exhaled. But for the duration of a held breath, the interference dropped below the threshold that mattered, and his hands became what he needed them to be. He positioned the silver tips on either side of the leech's attachment point, above the inner teeth, below the outer ring, at the exact depth that would lift the anchor without creating tension on the embedded structure. He'd practiced this on himself. Once. It hadn't gone well, but he'd learned from it. He exhaled. Slow, controlled. And in the same motion he lifted. The leech came away clean. He felt it the moment it cleared. A specific give in the resistance that meant the inner teeth had not separated, that the whole structure was intact, that the thing in his tweezers was complete and not leaving anything behind. He set it on the dry soil beside him, well clear of any surface she'd contact, and looked at the attachment point. Clean wound. Small, as such wounds go. A ring of shallow marks that would be tender for 2 days and gone in 4. He pressed the corner of her cloth against it, gentle, not rubbing, and held it there for a count of 10. She hadn't moved. The entire time, she had not moved. "Done," he said. She turned back around slowly. Her eyes went first to the leech on the soil, looking at it the way you look at a thing that was inside your body without your knowledge, with a specific expression that occupies the territory between revulsion and cold assessment. Then she looked at his hands. The tremor was back. Visible now that there was nothing demanding he suppress it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at his face. He met her eyes and didn't look away because there was no point. She'd seen it. She was deciding what it meant. What she did then was small. She reached out and took her cloth back from his hand, folded it once, and tucked it into her clothing. A simple, domestic motion. But her hand, as she took the cloth, moved slowly enough that it was not entirely about the cloth. The coals shifted. A small collapse of spent wood, glowing orange at the edges. Neither of them spoke. The swamp was quiet. The horns had not sounded in over an hour, and the silence had the quality of something earned rather than given, and they sat in it for a while without trying to fill it. Then from the south, faint but unmistakable, the tracking call of a hound starting up again. Fresh line, moving northeast. They had been found. He didn't stand immediately. The hound's call was faint. Distance plus canopy absorption put it at least a kilometer south, possibly more. A fresh line meant the handler had cast the dog wide, and it had picked up their ground scent at the point where they'd come through the reeds. That was the tracking problem with the Blackwater. Water entry and water exit confused scent trails, but the swamp floor held boot pressure impressions for hours, and a dog trained on compressed mud tracking rather than airborne scent could follow that record like a document. They had time. Not much, but enough that standing up in the next 30 seconds versus the next 5 minutes would not change the outcome. He used the time. "Take your shirt off," he said. "The back of it. Or pull it down, whichever." He was already reaching into the outer compartment of his bandolier, past the chemical vials to the secondary section he kept for field medicine. "The salve works on direct contact with tissue. Fabric blocks it." She looked at him. "Your back," he said. "I saw the scars when you came out of the cage. The ones from the bladed whips. If they've been in the water tonight, they'll be open at the surface. Salt swamp exposure after a fresh whip wound is how fighters in the pits developed infections that killed them slower than the fighting did." He found the small clay pot he was looking for, sealed with a wax cap. "I have blue moss compound. It closes surface tissue, neutralizes the salt exposure, and reduces the inflammation response. It takes 3 minutes to apply. We have 3 minutes." She held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, exactly, because she'd stopped being surprised by him in the way that initial surprise operates, quick and visible. This was something more considered. He was an unknown category, and she was running out of familiar frameworks to put him in. She pulled the back of her shirt down to her waist. He moved behind her and opened the clay pot. The blue moss compound was his own formulation, 18 months of iteration before he'd gotten the concentration right. The base was the luminescent moss from the northeast quadrant, harvested and ground fresh and mixed with a binding compound of rendered swamp root fat and a stabilizing mineral salt he extracted from the black limestone deposits at the swamp's edge. The result was a dense, cool salve that smelled faintly of copper and did exactly what he'd described. And he was quietly proud of it, in the way he was quietly proud of most things he'd made work through persistence rather than talent. The wounds stopped him, not because he hadn't known they were there. He'd noted them, filed them, moved on. But knowing and seeing from 2 feet away in firelight were different things. The scars on her back were not random. That was the first thing. They were patterned in the specific geometry of the bladed training whip used in underground pit circuits. He'd read about it in a garrison medical text years ago, in a chapter on treating fighters extracted from illegal operations. The bladed whip was not a punishment instrument. It was a training instrument. It taught blocking by removing the option of not blocking. Get your arm up in time, take the cut on the forearm. Don't get your arm up, take the cut somewhere worse. The pattern on her back was the record of a fighter learning under conditions that didn't allow for slow learning. The newest of the scars, not new, but newer than the others by the difference in their texture and color, ran in 2 diagonal lines from the left shoulder blade toward the lower right. These were not from training. The angle was wrong for a training whip. These were from something wielded in anger or in the performance of punishment, and they'd been deep enough that the tissue had healed, raised. He opened the pot, took a measured amount of salve on 2 fingers, and began. The muscle of her back resisted him immediately. Not because she flinched, she didn't, but because the density of the tissue itself was an obstacle. Years of the specific conditioning that pit fighting built had layered the muscle to a degree that made it difficult for pressure applied by a man of his build to reach the deeper tissue where the inflammation sat. He pressed harder, working the salve in with the heel of his palm rather than his fingers, using his body weight to supplement his hand strength. It was slow work. She was very still. "The diagonal ones," he said, keeping his voice flat and professional, the way he'd learned to discuss injuries in the garrison without loading the observation with anything the injured person hadn't offered first. "Those aren't from the training whip pattern." A pause. "No. Recent. 3 months. He worked the salve across the shoulder blade, following the scar line. "Salt mine," he said. not a question. He was placing the timeline. She'd been sold to the salt mines, which meant the diagonal scars predated that transfer, which meant they came from the pit circuit. "The last fight," she said. "The one I was sold after." He moved to the second diagonal line. "You won." She was quiet for a moment. "I won," she said, with the particular flatness of someone describing an outcome that had cost more than the reward was worth. The owner decided a gladiator who could win while bleeding that way was more valuable in the salt mines than in the pit. More years of use. She paused. He was not wrong. He pressed the salve into the lower scar line, slow and methodical. "How many years in the circuit?" 10, she said. "Since I was 15. He did the arithmetic without commenting on it. 15 years old, into the pits. 10 years of survival in an environment built specifically to eliminate the people inside it. The scars on her forearms, the ones he'd clocked as blade blocks, were not all from training. Some of them were too wide, too irregular. Those were from the actual fights, the ones where the other fighter was also trying to survive, and had learned, as she had, that the only reliable outcome was that one person walked out. She had walked out. 37 times by the average career length of a gladiator who survived 10 years, maybe more. "The collar," she said. "You said you could remove it at the cash point." "Yes." "How far?" "Tomorrow afternoon, if the paths hold and we don't lose time to the handlers." He moved to the right shoulder, where the oldest scars were. Pale, fully integrated into the surrounding skin, the texture of them barely distinguishable from the muscle beneath. These were from the beginning, from when she was 15 and learning what the bladed whip cost. "The cache is inside a limestone shelf formation, dry, elevated. There are 2 days of supplies there, food, clean water, a full set of refill compounds." She absorbed this in silence. He worked the salve across the right shoulder blade in slow, firm strokes. "You built a supply route," she said, "through a toxic swamp. Alone. For materials. And in case of emergencies." "What emergencies?" "Various ones." He moved to the lower back, where the muscle was densest and the anti-inflammatory properties of the compound were most needed. The tissue here was inflamed in a broad band, likely from the sustained posture of captivity, the iron collar's chain having forced her to sit with her neck and back in a fixed position for however long she'd been in the cage. He worked more compound into the area, patient, methodical. "I live alone in a laboratory next to a toxic swamp. Planning for emergencies is a professional habit." She made that sound again, the low exhale through the nose that he was beginning to categorize not as dismissal, but as the specific sound she made when something landed in the revised column rather than the expected one. He was accumulating them there, apparently. He found he didn't mind. The blue moss compound had a mild analgesic property, not strong enough to call it pain relief, but enough that the surface inflammation would quiet within 10 minutes of application. He worked it across the full span of her back in 3 final slow passes, ensuring even coverage, and then replaced the wax cap on the clay pot. "Done," he said. "Don't let the fabric compress it for 5 minutes. Let the compound set before the shirt covers it." She remained still, back bare, facing the dying coals. The salve caught the orange light and gave her skin a faint blue-green luminescence, the moss compound's natural property not quite extinguished by the grinding process. In the swamp's dark, with the coals low and the mist moving through the canopy overhead, she looked like something from a different world than the cage he'd pulled her from 4 hours ago. Less like a thing that had been owned, more like herself, whatever that meant. He capped the pot, replaced it in the bandolier, and moved to his feet. From the south, the hound's tracking note was clearer now, sustained and directional. It had the line and was running it, and behind it, just audible at the edge of perception, a second voice joined in. Two hounds, working the same track, converging northeast. 5 minutes is 3 minutes now, he said. She pulled her shirt up, stood, and picked up the iron bar. The coals gave one last pulse of orange and went to gray. Dawn came without light. The sky above the canopy went from black to a uniform, heavy gray. The kind of gray that isn't the transition to morning so much as the replacement of one darkness with another, flatter one. Vane had seen it before on the northeast routes, always at this hour, always in this section of the swamp where the canopy thinned and the open water expanded and the conditions that produced the swamp fog were at their most favorable. Favorable being the wrong word. The conditions that produced the swamp fog were cold, standing water, decaying organic matter at the surface, and a temperature inversion in the early hours that trapped the resulting acidic gas layer at ground level, rather than allowing it to disperse upward. He smelled it before he saw it. A faint chemical bite at the back of the throat, like the ghost of a compound he'd once spilled in the laboratory. Not the spill itself, but the memory of the smell, arriving ahead of the thing it was warning you about. He stopped walking. She stopped 2 steps behind him. "Fog," he said. She looked ahead. The mist was already visible at path level. Not the ordinary water vapor mist they'd walked through all night, which was cool and neutral and simply reduced visibility. This was lower and denser, moving with the slow, deliberate quality of something heavier than air settling into the available spaces. It collected in the depressions of the root mat, in the gaps between water surfaces, in the hollow where the path dipped 6 inches below the surrounding terrain. It glowed faintly at its upper edge, where the gray dawn light caught it, and it had the specific wrong color of something that should not be breathed. He was already removing his outer coat. She watched him lay it on the root mat and reach into the third compartment of his bandolier. Not the vials, not the instruments, but the raw materials section, where he kept the component powders and sealed paper packets. He found charcoal by weight, damp clay by texture, opened both, began working them together in his palm with a small measure of water from his flask. "Breathing the fog without protection," he said, working the mixture, "causes progressive chemical burn to the mucous lining of the lungs. Mild exposure, a few minutes, produces a cough that lasts 2 days. An hour of exposure produces permanent reduction in lung capacity." He worked the clay and charcoal to a thick, uniform paste, adding water carefully. The clay neutralizes the acid content. The charcoal absorbs the particulate. Together, they filter enough of the compound to make the air breathable for 6 to 8 hours. She crouched beside him, watching his hands work. He took a portion of the paste and applied it across his own face first, across the nose and mouth and the skin around both, pressing it into a layer thick enough to sit without cracking when he moved his jaw. The paste was cold and gritty and smelled of mineral earth and nothing else. He worked it carefully around his bad eye, which was already more vulnerable to airborne irritants than the good one. Then he looked up. "Your face," he said. "Stay still." She did not look comfortable with this. Her jaw tightened by a fraction, not refusal, but the instinctive resistance of someone unaccustomed to having another person's hands near their face. In the pit circuit, hands near your face meant one specific category of thing. He understood this and moved without hesitation, because hesitation would have made it worse. He applied the paste with the same clinical efficiency he'd used on the leech extraction, measured, purposeful, no excess contact beyond what the task required. The paste covered the planes of her face differently than his. Her bone structure was heavier at the brow and jaw, the surface area larger, and he had to work a second measure of paste from his palm to ensure full coverage across her nose and the lower face. He applied it in sections, pressing it gently into the contours. She held perfectly still, the way she'd held still for the leech, not relaxed, but controlled. The chain at her collar swayed slightly and settled. He finished and examined the coverage. Even, adequate. He nodded once and began folding his coat. "The water ahead," he said. The path northeast dipped into a sustained section of open water. He knew this stretch. It ran for approximately 30 paces at a depth that varied between his knee and his hip, with the root mat submerged completely, the path marked only by the spacing of the mangrove trunks on either side. He crossed it on supply runs by feel and by the staff. He crossed it alone, at his own pace, with no weight beyond the bandolier. "It's too deep for me to cross with my supplies dry. The bottom files on the bandolier will go under." She looked at the water line ahead, where the fog sat thickest, collected across the surface in a layer that turned the water invisible below it. "I'll carry you," she said. Not an offer, a statement of logistics, the same tone she used for everything practical. He looked at her. He was a man who had spent 11 years managing his own insufficiencies with enough competence that they rarely required someone else's intervention. And this particular insufficiency, his own inability to cross 30 paces of chest-deep water without destroying his equipment, was one he'd solved on supply runs by stripping the bandolier and holding it above his head, which was slow and exposed and not a viable option while being tracked by trained hounds. "Yes," he said. She crouched and he stepped onto her back. Not her shoulders, which would have put him too high and off balance, but a low carry, his chest against her upper back, his legs around her rib cage, the bandolier pressed between them away from the water. She stood without effort and stepped into the water. The fog closed around them immediately. At water level, it was dense enough to reduce visibility to 10 feet, the mangrove trunks appearing and disappearing as they moved between them. The acidic bite was present even through the clay charcoal paste, not overwhelming, not penetrating, but present at the edge of each breath as a reminder of what it would be without the filter. He focused on the paste coverage, monitoring his own breathing, noting that the filtration was holding. She moved through the water with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had learned that speed in uncertain terrain costs more than it saves. The water was at her waist by the third step, then her hips, then leveling off as the path found its consistent depth. She held her arms slightly out from her sides for balance, not needing to hold him. His own grip was sufficient. Her attention on the root mat below the water's surface, feeling it with her feet through her boots the way he felt it with his staff above ground. He became aware from this position of details he hadn't registered before. The way her breathing was completely steady despite his added weight. The specific quality of the muscle movement beneath him, not the jerking compensation of someone straining, but the smooth, load-bearing motion of a body that had spent a decade under resistance and had built its architecture accordingly. She was not carrying him with effort. She was carrying him the way a wall bears weight. The load was simply within the designed capacity of the structure, and the structure didn't notice. Halfway across, she stopped. He kept still, reading the pause. She was looking left, her head turned at a slight angle, listening. He listened too. Through the fog and the water sounds and his own filtered breathing, he could hear what had stopped her, the soft, rhythmic splash of something moving through water. Not a hound. The pattern was wrong, too measured, too deliberate. A person, moving parallel to their path, approximately 20 feet off to the left, obscured by the fog. A handler, on foot, moving northeast, same direction, either ahead of or running alongside the hounds to maintain close coordination. She didn't look back at him, but she slowed her already careful pace to something below sound, lifting each foot and placing it with absolute deliberation, finding the root mat with her toe before shifting weight, producing not even the small displacement sounds of normal, careful walking. 30 paces in waist-deep water, in thick fog, with a man on her back and a handler 20 feet to the left. She made it without a sound. The far bank rose under her feet, and she stepped up onto the route mat and kept moving northeast without pausing, putting distance between them and the water crossing. The handler's footsteps faded to the left. He'd passed their crossing point without knowing it, parallel lines in the fog, 20 feet apart. When they were 50 paces clear, she stopped and crouched to let him down. He stepped off, checked his bandolier, dry, all of it, and looked back at the fog bank covering the water crossing. The handler's shape was invisible. The fog had swallowed the whole section. He looked at her. The clay charcoal paste across her face made her expression harder to read than usual, which was already not easy. But she was watching the fog bank with the focused stillness of someone running numbers. How close, how many, what they knew, what they didn't. "He didn't see us," Vane said quietly. "No," she said, "but he's ahead of us now." She picked up the iron bar from where she'd secured it through her belt during the crossing. "Yes," she said. From behind them to the south, both hounds called simultaneously. They had the line again. And from ahead, somewhere northeast in the fog, the handler's footsteps continued, steady and unknowing. They were boxed between the two. The handler ahead was the more immediate problem. The hounds behind them were running a scent trail. They needed time to close distance, and the fog was slowing them the same way it was slowing everything else. The handler ahead was on foot, moving at walking pace, and he didn't know he had company. That was an advantage with a short shelf life. The moment the hounds behind them closed enough distance that their handler could signal the forward unit, the advantage was gone. He had, at an estimate, 20 minutes before the two units were in communication range. He thought about the sporopods. There had been a cluster near the water crossing. He'd noted them on the left bank just above the waterline where the fog sat thick and the handler had been walking. But that was behind them now, and the handler was ahead, and the pods grew in clusters along the root systems, which meant there were likely more of them in the stretch ahead. If the handler was moving without testing the ground, which a man moving in familiar territory tended to do, then there was a reasonable chance the terrain would manage that problem without Vane's intervention. He kept this thought to himself and moved northeast, staff in hand, reading the ground. She walked beside him now instead of behind. The path had widened into a broad, stable section of old root mat, compacted firm, with good visibility even through the thinning fog. Walking abreast meant he could see her peripheral reactions to the terrain, which told him things. She was reading the ground differently than he did. Not with a staff, but with her eyes, scanning ahead in a flat, low pattern that he recognized from the garrison as the sightline pattern trained fighters used in enclosed spaces. Wide field, not narrow focus. Looking for movement, not detail. The hunting horn, when it came, was not from south or north. It was from directly ahead. Deep and resonant. The kind of sound that a wide brass instrument makes when it's blown by someone with full lungs. One sustained note, then silence. Not a signal, not a call pattern. A single blow, the kind used to mark position when separated from your unit. The handler, somewhere in the fog ahead, announcing himself to the units behind. She stopped. So did Vane. Beside him, not behind him. He was aware of the alignment of it, the two of them standing still in the dissipating fog while the horn's note finished and the silence rushed back in. Then, from behind and to the south, two answering notes, the rear units marking themselves in return. 3 points of sound, and he and Roka were between all of them, in the middle of the triangle. She looked at him. The paste on her face had dried and cracked at the edges where her jaw moved, and through the cracks he could read the line of her jaw more clearly, set hard, the muscles at the corner working once and stopping. He looked ahead. The path northeast continued, firm underfoot. But the handler was on it, somewhere in the remaining fog. Unknown distance, maybe 30 paces, maybe 100. No way to know without closing the gap, which was the one thing that would end the advantage of not being seen. He looked down. His staff. He'd been using it all night. 4 feet of dense hardwood, iron-tipped, carried for 4 years through this swamp. He used it to test ground, to lever himself out of soft patches, to balance on the root mat's narrow sections. It was the one piece of equipment he had that was not chemical, not precise, not the product of his particular skill set. He dropped it. Not by accident, deliberately, releasing his grip and letting it fall to the root mat. It hit with a sharp, flat crack. In the quiet that followed the horn, in the fog-damped acoustic environment of the swamp's upper register, the sound carried exactly as far as he'd calculated it would. The handler's footsteps ahead stopped. He heard the handler turn, the soft compression of root mat underfoot as the man shifted his weight, orienting toward the sound. 30 feet, he assessed. Maybe 35. Close enough that a trained man would be listening hard right now, trying to determine whether the sound he'd heard was animal or human. Vane reached down and picked the staff back up. She looked at him with an expression that, through the dried paste and the flat assessment she wore as a default, contained something that might, in better light, with more context, have been the beginning of recalibration. He was a man who had just deliberately dropped and retrieved his only physical support tool in order to locate a target by listening to them stop moving. She was updating something. 30 feet, he said, very quietly. He turned toward us when the staff hit. He's listening. She nodded once. When he turns back, Vane said, he'll move again. We follow behind him and let the fog cover the gap. If it thins before we reach the bend in the path... He stopped. He reached into his bandolier. Not a vial, but the small paper packet of charcoal powder, the one he'd used a portion of for the paste. He held it up. She looked at it. Dry charcoal in still air produces a visible dark smoke screen when ignited, enough to reduce visibility to 4 feet for 2 minutes. If the fog thins, I use this. If I use this, you move fast and I follow. She looked at the packet, then at the fog ahead, then back at him. And if there are 2 of them? There's 1, he said. 1 set of footsteps. The horn call was a solo position mark. She held his gaze for a moment, processing, accepting. She gripped the iron bar in both hands, holding it horizontal across her body, not raised, not threatening, but ready. The default carry of someone who had learned to keep their weapon in the fastest possible position for multiple response types. The handler ahead moved. His footsteps resumed, northeast, at a slightly faster pace than before. The sound had made him alert, but not alarmed, and alert people moved faster than relaxed people. Good. Distance was what they needed. Vane moved after him, silent on the firm root mat, staff in hand. She matched his pace on his left side. They walked like this for 4 minutes, the handler ahead invisible in the last wisps of fog, his footsteps providing a reliable audio marker, Vane maintaining the gap by ear. 30 feet. 35. The fog was thinning with the rising temperature of morning, the acidic layer dissipating as the inversion broke down, the visibility extending from 10 feet to 15 to 20. At 20 feet, the path bent northeast around a large limestone outcrop, and the handler disappeared around it. At the same moment, Vane's right boot came down on the root mat and found nothing solid beneath it. The mat had given way. Old rot, long undermined, holding up until this specific combination of weight and angle. His foot went through to mid-calf instantly, the rotten root mat collapsing around it in a soft, wet implosion. He caught himself with the staff, planted it hard, stopped the fall at the knee. But the staff found the edge of the same rotten section and punched through it, tilting at a sharp angle. And for 1 full second, he had no reliable support at all. He went sideways. Not down, sideways. One arm out, one leg through the root mat, the bandolier swinging with the shift of weight in a glass and metal chime that was, in the quiet of the dissipating fog, approximately as subtle as the hunting horn had been. She had him by the forearm before the second chime. She pulled him sideways onto the intact root mat to the left of the rotten section, the same smooth extraction she'd performed in the water and on the bank. No wasted movement, no excess force, just the precise application of what was needed. He came clear of the hole with a wet sucking sound that he could not have prevented, and she released him the moment he had footing. He stood still and listened. Ahead, around the limestone outcrop, the handler's footsteps had stopped. Complete stop. No shuffling, no weight shift. The kind of stop that meant the person had heard something and was now standing absolutely still, listening with their full attention. The fog was at 15 feet now and dropping. In 2 minutes it would be at 10. In 5, it would be gone. She gripped the iron bar. He reached into his bandolier, and his fingers found 3 vials clinking softly together in the last 2 slots of the left row. 3 vials. He'd used the acid on the cage lock, the solvent on the anchor chain, the freezing compound on the first hound. 3 remaining. The charcoal packet in his outer pocket, 2 uncertain vials in the middle row that he still hadn't fully assessed after the water immersion. He'd thought there were more. He counted again. 3. He looked at the limestone outcrop. The handler was on the other side of it. The hounds were behind them and closing. And the path northeast, the only path to the free territories, went around that outcrop and past wherever the handler was standing. She was already looking at him, waiting. Not impatiently, with the specific quality of attention she had given him since the reed stand, when she'd watched him set up the spore pod trap without being told to. Waiting to see what the vials were going to do about this. He reached into his coat pocket and closed his fingers around the charcoal packet. Then the handler's voice came from behind the outcrop, low, addressed to someone not visible, and was answered, not by a horn, by a second voice. Alongside the first set of footsteps, a second set resumed. Not 1 handler, 2. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fog thinned another foot, and the limestone outcrop came into sharper relief ahead of them, pale gray and absolute, flanked on both sides by the dark water of the swamp with no viable path around it. "Run," she said, not loud, barely above a breath. "I will hold them." He said nothing for a moment, then, "No." She looked at him with the expression of someone dealing with a logical error they didn't have time to correct. "You cannot fight 2 handlers." "I didn't ruin my boots," he said quietly, "to leave you here." The fog dropped another foot. The handlers came around the outcrop 30 seconds later. 2 men, as the voices had indicated. The first was larger, broad across the chest, carrying a catch pole with a loop of chain at the end, the kind used for close-quarter restraint when hounds weren't viable. The second was leaner, moving with the particular loose-limbed ease of someone who'd done this work long enough that it had stopped requiring much thought. He had a short crossbow, already cranked, bolt-seated. Standard slaver field kit. Vane had seen the configuration before, in garrison reports on illegal transport operations. 1 restrainer, 1 suppressor. The suppressors aimed for the legs. They stopped when they saw the 2 of them standing in the open on the root mat. The larger handler looked at Vane, then at Roca, then at the chain still hanging from her collar. His expression didn't change. the professional absence of reaction that comes from encountering the expected thing in an unexpected location. "Back up," Vane said quietly to her. She didn't move. Her boots were planted on the root mat, the iron bar held horizontal across her body, and she was looking at the crossbow the way a fighter looks at the thing most likely to end the engagement. Threat hierarchy. She'd identified it immediately. "Roka." Quiet, flat. "Back up." She took one step back. One. He took it. They moved northeast, backward, keeping their faces toward the handlers, Vane using his peripheral vision to read the path behind him because turning his back on a cranked crossbow was not a calculation he was willing to make. The handlers followed at a professional distance, close enough to maintain pressure, far enough that a sudden rush would cost the rusher something. The larger one was already spinning the catch-pole loop, keeping the chain moving. Experienced. He'd done this 100 times. He knew the geometry of restraint. Vane watched the ground behind him with his bad eye, which was useless for precision, but could still detect the gross changes in terrain that mattered right now. The root mat narrowed, then narrowed again. Then the ambient sound behind them changed. The specific change produced when open water is close, the way echo drops and the air goes flat. He stopped. He knew this section. He'd been to this section once, in his second year, on a supply run that had taken a wrong turn at the limestone outcrop and ended here. He'd stood in exactly this spot and looked at exactly this wall and turned around and gone home and corrected his map. The limestone rose behind them in a sheer face, ancient, water-smoothed, 10 feet tall and continuous in both directions. The face wasn't vertical, but slightly overhung at the top lip jutting forward over the base, which meant that even at his arm's length above his head, there was nothing to grip. He reached back with one hand and pressed his palm against it. Cold. Wet. Slick with the biofilm that grew on submerged limestone faces above the waterline. She felt it, too. She turned her head slightly, just enough to register the wall behind them, and turned back to the handlers. Her boots found the root mat's end, and she planted them there, the last 2 feet of solid ground before the wall. The iron bar came up, not raised high, held forward, the end angled slightly down, the grip adjusted from transit carry to use carry. The difference was subtle and meant everything. The larger handler slowed his approach. The catch-pole stopped spinning. The leaner one with the crossbow held his position. The bolt stayed leveled at her left thigh. Vane stood beside her and looked at what he had. 3 vials. He went through them again, because the count mattered, and he needed to be precise about it. First, a freezing compound, full vial, intact. He knew what it did, and how far it threw, and what the splash radius was. Second, the contact accelerant. This one was in the uncertain category, water damage possible, behavior on release, therefore, unpredictable. Could work as designed, could have degraded into something that reacted badly to air exposure. He didn't know. Third, the last vial, rightmost slot, a compound he'd been developing for 6 months and had field-tested exactly once. A gas-release agent. Mixed with the right organic substrate, it produced a dense, sustained smoke screen. Mixed with the wrong substrate, it produced a sustained smoke screen and a secondary exothermic reaction. He'd designed it for smoke. The exothermic component was, officially, an error he hadn't corrected yet. He looked at the mud beneath the handler's feet, then at the bubbling patches at the water's edge to his left, where the dark mud was producing small, irregular rises of gas that broke at the surface in slow, wet pops. He'd seen those all night, noted them, moved past them. Methane expression from the organic decay layer beneath the mud. The black water was full of it on the northeast paths. You learned to not carry open flame near those patches. He looked at the vial in the third slot. He looked at the mud. Something began assembling itself in the back of his mind with the quiet, specific efficiency of a solution arriving. Not fast, methodical, piece by piece, like a compound reaching its reaction temperature. "What?" she said, very quietly, not looking at him. "I'm thinking," he said. The larger handler took another step forward. The catch-pole loop swung out and landed on the route mat in front of him, a practiced throw, testing range. It fell short of Roka by 4 feet. He was measuring. She shifted her weight. The iron bar moved in a small, controlled arc, a warning, not a swing. The handler read it correctly and stopped advancing. "The mud," Vane said, still quiet. She didn't look at the mud. "What about it?" "The bubbling patches, to the left, past the water edge." A pause. "I see them." "That's methane. The mud here is saturated with it. The decomposition layer is active, venting through the surface. It's distributed across the substrate for approximately 20 feet in every direction." He watched the larger handler's feet. The man's left boot was 6 inches from the edge of the route mat, where the dark water began, where the mud beneath the water was actively venting. If that layer were catalyzed, if the gas were concentrated and ignited, the result would be a distributed detonation, not a point explosion. A wave moving outward from the catalyst point through the substrate. She processed this. He felt her processing it. The slight change in her breathing, the almost imperceptible shift in her focus from the handlers to the ground between them. How large? Substantial. He had the gas release vial in his fingers now, reading its weight. Full. The water hadn't compromised it. He could tell by the viscosity, the way the liquid moved when he tilted it. The limestone wall behind us would contain the blast on one side. The water on both sides would direct it forward along the route mat corridor. "Forward," she said. "Toward them." "And toward us," he said. "The blast radius will include this position." A silence, short. She was looking at the handlers. The crossbow man had shifted his aim slightly, tracking, compensating for her weight shift. He was professional. He was watching her hands. "Then you need to not be in it," she said. "I need to place the catalyst precisely," he said. "The gas release agent needs to be introduced into the active venting points in the mud, not on the surface. I have to be at ground level to do it, which means I can't be behind the wall at the moment of ignition." He paused. "Neither can you, if you're still in the blast radius." She said nothing for a moment. "How much time?" she said. "Between catalyst placement and ignition. I can set a delayed spark with the flint mount on my staff. 8 seconds. Maybe 10. He watched the larger handler begin to move again, slow, measuring steps. "If we place it and move simultaneously, 8 seconds is enough to clear the radius." "If," she said. He didn't respond to that. It was an accurate summary. The larger handler was 6 feet away now, the catch-pole loop raised. He looked at Roka with the particular calm of a man who had handled berserker-class fighters before and had developed opinions about the most efficient approach. He'd aim for the legs first, drop her mobility, bring the chain down over the shoulders while she was managing the fall. Vane could read the sequence in the handler's body mechanics the way he read a chemical reaction. The steps visible in the arrangement of the components, the outcome inevitable once the first step was taken. Roka's grip tightened on the iron bar. Her left foot moved back 2 inches, weight transferring to her rear foot. Combat stance, settled and economical. She was ready to take the hit and work through it if the hit was unavoidable. She'd done it before, many times. She knew how to survive contact. "I didn't ruin my boots," Vane said quietly. "To let you die here." She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the catchpole. But something in the set of her jaw shifted. A small, unannounced change. The kind that registers in the peripheral vision rather than in direct observation. "Place the catalyst," she said. "When I say now," he said, "move for the wall, both of us." "Place it," she said. He dropped to one knee and uncorked the third vial. The mud was cold against his knee. He registered it distantly. The wet seep through the fabric of his trousers. The particular clinging cold of the black water substrate when it made direct contact with skin. Not important. He filed it and moved on. The gas release agent in the vial was viscous, thicker than water, thinner than the blue moss compound, with a faint amber color that he'd never been entirely satisfied with because the chemistry that produced the amber also produced the exothermic component he hadn't resolved. It moved slowly when he tilted the vial, which was useful right now. He needed it to go down, not out. The active venting points in the mud were the key. He could see 3 of them from ground level, small, irregular depressions in the mud surface where the methane was finding its way up through the decomposition layer, each one marked by a slow rise and break of the surface, a rhythmic pulse that the mud produced without hurry, indifferent to everything happening above it. He needed the agent introduced directly into the active channel, not spread across the surface where it would dissipate before building sufficient concentration. He pressed 2 fingers into the first vent point. The mud took his fingers to the second knuckle before he felt the resistance of the underlying organic layer. A dense, fibrous substrate, the accumulated decades of plant matter that had sunk and compressed and was now decomposing in the low oxygen environment below the surface. He worked his fingers to the side, widening the channel slightly, and felt the methane pressure against his skin. Faint, steady. There was a great deal of it down there, more than enough. He tipped the vial and let the agent run down his fingers into the channel. The hounds were in the reeds to the south. He could hear them, not the sustained tracking call of distance pursuit, but the short, clipped vocalizations of animals closing on a fixed point, working themselves up for the final approach. 40 seconds, maybe less. The rear unit had been running the track for 20 minutes since the fog crossing. They were nearly through. The larger handler had stopped advancing when Vane dropped to his knee. The handler was reading the action, processing what a man dropping to the ground in front of a limestone wall might be doing, working through the options. Vane could feel the handler's attention like a physical thing, the weight of professional assessment landing on the back of his neck. He ignored it. He had the vial tipped into the first vent, watching the agent disappear into the channel, and he kept his focus on the mud. "You," the handler said, addressing Vane. "Stand up. Hands where I can see them." Vane moved to the second vent point. "Stand up." He pressed his fingers into the second channel, found the organic layer, introduced the agent. The viscous liquid moved slowly, and he tilted the vial to increase the flow rate, watching the level inside drop by a quarter. He needed to distribute it across at least 3 points to ensure the catalytic reaction propagated laterally through the substrate rather than venting straight up at a single point. A single-point vent would produce a localized release, potentially impressive, but not the sustained wave he needed to direct down the corridor. The handler with the crossbow made a decision. Vane heard the footsteps. The leaner man moving forward, closing the distance to use range, the crossbow adjusting angle to account for the new target below him. He'd switched his aim from Roca to Vane. That was a reasonable tactical decision. It was also the wrong one. She moved the moment the crossbow swiveled. Not toward the crossbow man, toward the catchpole handler, the larger one, who had taken his attention off her for 3 seconds while his colleague repositioned. 3 seconds was not long. It was long enough. The iron bar came forward in a low, flat arc aimed at the catchpole, not at the man, at the tool, and connected with the chain loop at full extension, snapping the loop out of the handler's grip and sending it spinning into the dark water to the left. The larger handler stepped back. The crossbowman swung back toward her. "Don't," Vane said. He was on the third vent point. His fingers were in the mud to the second knuckle. The vial was nearly empty. "The bolt goes in the mud. It ignites the substrate. We all go up." He wasn't certain of this, whether a crossbow bolt striking mud would produce sufficient spark to catalyze the agent in the vent channels. He was less than 50% certain, but the certainty with which he said it was total, and the handler with the crossbow didn't have a chemistry education. The bolt stayed where it was. He emptied the last of the vial into the third channel, withdrew his fingers, and stood. His hands were black with mud to the wrist. The bandolier was almost empty. He could tell by the way it sat, lighter than it had ever been since he'd built it. He uncorked the first vial, the freezing compound, and held it in his right hand, not because he intended to use it as a weapon, but because holding it kept his hands occupied and his expression calibrated to the task. He needed another 30 seconds. He needed the handlers to spend those seconds making calculations rather than decisions. "The vent channels run northeast," he said conversationally. He was watching the mud between himself and the two handlers. "The methane substrate follows the root system topology. It goes toward the limestone base, which is porous, which means the gas has been accumulating in the fissures behind us for decades." He looked at the larger handler's feet. The man was standing directly over a vent point, one he hadn't introduced agent to, one that was cycling on its own. The mud pulsed once beneath the handler's left boot. The man didn't feel it through his leather sole. "This entire section of path is, functionally, a sealed gas chamber with a mud cap." The larger handler looked at the ground beneath his feet. That was the moment. Vane had learned in years of working with volatile compounds, but the most dangerous instant in a chemical process was not the reaction itself, but the 3 seconds before the person managing it looked away from what they were doing. Those 3 seconds were where the accidents happened. He had just created 3 seconds. He looked at his staff. He'd modified the tip 3 years ago, replaced the standard iron ferrule with a fitted flint mount, a small bracket that held a struck flint at the correct angle to throw a spark downward when the staff was driven against a hard surface. He'd done it because the Blackwater's paths included sections of exposed limestone where the flint contact was reliable, and because a disgraced alchemist living alone next to a toxic swamp had found on several occasions that having a fire-starting capability integrated into his primary support tool was more practical than keeping a separate kit. He'd never used it for anything more dramatic than lighting the smokeless fire inside the mangrove root. He drove the staff into the ground at the second vent point, the deepest one, the one he'd introduced the most agent to. Flint hit limestone through the mud and threw a spark downward into the channel. "Now," he said. She was already moving. He felt it more than saw it. The displacement of air at his left side as she crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, then her hand, closing on the back of his coat, and the sudden loss of ground contact as she lifted him and threw. Not gently, not carefully. She threw him the way you throw something you need to get behind cover fast, with direction and force and the absolute absence of anything except the goal. He cleared the root mat and the water edge and hit the base of the limestone wall at a controlled angle, rolling with the impact the way the garrison's combat training had taught him and his body had mostly forgotten, taking it on the shoulder and the hip rather than the back. The bandolier protected its vials by his own spine being between it and the wall, which was painful but effective. He got his arms up and his face down. The blast was not loud. That was the first thing. Not the concussive crack of a powder charge, not the theatrical percussion of a siege weapon. It was a deep, wet thump, like the sound a door makes when slammed in a stone corridor, but distributed, rolling. moving through the substrate rather than through the air. He felt it in his chest and his knees before he heard it, which was how ground-propagated detonations worked. Then the gas above the mud caught. The secondary ignition, the methane layer between the substrate and the surface air, was fast and blue and almost entirely silent. A flat sheet of pale fire, knee-height, extending outward from the vent points in a fast, even radius. It lasted less than 2 seconds. It was not spectacular. It was extremely thorough. The toxic smoke came immediately after, the gas release agent's primary function, the thing it had been designed to do. Dense, gray-white, rolling outward along the ground ahead of the dying flame, filling the corridor between the water edges to a height of 8 feet, reducing visibility inside it to 0. He heard the handlers. Both of them. Not words, but the sounds of people responding to sudden disorientation in an environment they no longer controlled. Movement sounds, urgent and uncoordinated. The larger handler had been over a vent point. He heard that too, briefly, and then the smoke took everything. He pressed himself against the limestone base and waited. 3 seconds. 5. From inside the smoke, a sound he recognized. The iron bar, moving fast in a space where the person using it knew exactly what they were doing, and the people on the receiving end of it did not. Twice. The sounds were not complicated, and they did not require elaboration, and they were followed by the unambiguous silence of a situation that had reached its conclusion. Then her footsteps, coming toward him through the smoke, unhurried. She came out of the gray-white cloud at the limestone base and stopped beside him. The paste had burned off her face on one side. A section of it had taken the edge of the flash, leaving the skin beneath clean and unmarked, but the paste gone. She was breathing normally. Her grip on the bar was still the use-carry grip, and she held it that way for a moment longer, then shifted it back to transit. She looked at him against the wall, at the mud on his hands, at the empty bandolier. He looked at the smoke still rolling across the path and the water in the corridor ahead. The methane now burned out at the substrate, but the agent still producing its cloud overhead, thinning at the edges as it dispersed. The limestone wall had done exactly what he'd estimated, contained the backblast, directed the pressure forward through the corridor. The math had been right. His hands were shaking again. Not from cold this time. She reached down and closed one hand around his forearm, not gripping, just making contact, the pressure steady and present, and pulled him upright from the wall. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes," he said. She released his arm. "Then walk." The smoke was thinning northeast. The path beyond it was clear. The smoke thinned faster than he'd calculated. He'd estimated 8 minutes of coverage from the gas release agent at that concentration, enough to clear the corridor, reach the bend in the path past the limestone outcrop, and put sufficient distance between them and the blast site that the rear unit's hounds would lose the trail at the chemical contamination zone. The contamination zone was real. The agent's residue would mask scent at ground level for hours. He designed that property into it deliberately, in the laboratory, in the abstract. It was satisfying to see it work in practice, and he made a note to record the field result, which was the kind of thought a man had when his hands had stopped shaking and his mind had returned to its default operating mode. She walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind, beside. Which was a change from the first hours of the night, and he was aware of it without drawing attention to it. The path past the limestone outcrop was good, broad, firm, the root mat old and compressed, the kind of surface that would hold their pace without demanding constant attention. The spore pods were sparse here. The water was present on both sides, but set back from the path edge, giving them margin. He could see ahead for 30 feet, which was more than he'd had in hours, and the gray dawn light was brightening towards something that might eventually become actual morning. He checked the bandolier. Empty left row, empty center row. The uncertain vials in the middle row. He checked them again. The contact accelerant. Possible degradation. Behavior on release unknown. The second one, a binding compound, used in his laboratory for fixing chemical layers to surfaces, water damaged. He could tell by the shift in viscosity. Useless as a weapon, possibly dangerous on release if the degradation had produced an acidic byproduct. He recapped it carefully and left it in the slot, inert inside the sealed vial, and unknown outside it. 2 vials, both compromised. 1 staff. One woman with an iron bar who had just walked out of a smoke screen through 2 armed handlers and come back with no visible injury, which he had noted and was choosing not to comment on because she hadn't invited comment. The hunting horn, when it came, was different from all the previous ones. Not a signal, not a position mark. A sustained, rising note that climbed and held and climbed again. The recall and converge call. The one that meant the unit commander had taken personal control of the hunt. He'd heard it once before, in the garrison, when a senior tracker called in all field units to a single point. It was the call used when the situation had changed from routine pursuit to direct engagement, when the unit commander had decided that coordination was no longer optional. The slaver captain. He'd been mentioned in the context of the operation. Whoever had organized the prison wagon, the hounds, the handlers. Not a field operative. The captain would have been managing from a distance, directing units, staying clean. The 2 units they'd handled tonight were field teams. A captain who blew the converge call was a captain who had personally entered the field. Vane looked at the path ahead. The free territories were northeast. The cache point was northeast. According to his mental map, walked twice, checked against landmarks, adjusted for seasonal path shift, they were perhaps 90 minutes from the cache at current pace. Perhaps 40 minutes from the point where the path entered the elevated limestone shelf country at the swamp's edge, where the terrain changed from root mat over mud to solid ground over rock. Once on the rock, the tracking hounds were effectively neutralized. The stone held no scent, no compression, no trace. 40 minutes. The converge call sounded again. Closer. He moved faster. She kept pace without being asked. They were moving at something near a run now. Not quite, because running on root mat in low light was how you ended up in the mud to the waist, but the fastest, sustained pace the terrain would support. His staff worked ahead of him in quick, short jabs, reading the ground at speed. His bad eye was irrelevant at this pace. He was using peripheral movement detection and the staff's contact feedback to navigate, trusting his feet to manage the details. The path narrowed. Not gradually, abruptly, the root mat pinching between 2 sections of deep water that had expanded since his last survey, possibly from last night's rain or from the disturbance of the blast shifting the water table in this section. The viable corridor reduced from 10 feet wide to 3, and the root mat at the edges was wet and compressed, actively subsiding into the water. He slowed and tested the center line. It held. They went through single file, her behind him, and on the far side the path opened again, and he breathed. The hound that came from the left side of the path was not the same class as the one at the reed stand. He heard it half a second before it broke from the undergrowth. Not the working vocalization of a dog on a scent trail, but the flat, accelerating silence of a dog that had already fixed its target visually and was covering the distance. Slaver Captain's personal animal. He'd heard about this type, too. Raised on close work hunting, trained to target a specific point on the body and hold, not to wound, but to immobilize until the handler arrived. Heavier than the swamp stock breeds, faster in a short sprint. It came out of the reeds at the path's left edge in a flat, low trajectory aimed at his forearm, the arm with the bandolier. the one the animal had clearly been trained to identify as the operative appendage. He registered the precision of it in the fraction of a second between seeing it and reacting. And what he registered was that someone had specifically trained this animal to target an alchemist's carrying arm, which meant the captain knew who he was dealing with. He threw himself backward. The hound overshot by 18 inches, his backward fall taking his arm out of the target zone, and landed on the root mat between them, turning fast, scrambling for purchase, reacquiring. He was on his back, his staff somewhere to his right, the bandoleer's weight pinning him slightly to the left. He got his arm up and found the accelerant vial in the middle row. Compromised. Unknown behavior on release. He uncorked it and threw it at the hound's chest anyway. The degraded compound hit the dog's chest and did not do what it was designed to do. What it did instead was produce a sustained, violent chemical heat, not flame, but the kind of focused thermal reaction that occurs when an accelerant compound degrades toward its acidic byproduct and then makes contact with organic material. The dog made a sound and moved off him fast, rolling sideways off the root mat and into the water. He heard the hiss of chemical contact with water, and the sound cut off. He lay on the root mat for 2 seconds, cataloging damage. Left shoulder bruised from the fall. Right hand, the one that had held the vial, was warm at the fingertips where the degraded compound had splashed on release. Not burned. The margin had been narrow. 1 vial left. The binding compound with the possible acidic byproduct. He did not intend to use it the same way. She pulled him up. Same grip on the forearm, same pull, but faster than the limestone wall, less controlled, the urgency in it different. She got him upright, and they were moving before he'd finished standing, her hand releasing him the moment he had footing, both of them northeast at the maximum pace the path would hold. The captain's horn sounded from directly behind them. Close. The kind of close that meant the man himself was on the path, not directing from distance. Vane ran the numbers. 1 vial, compromised. 1 staff. 40 minutes to the rock shelf. The captain behind them converging, with at least 1 more hound. The captain's unit would have 3 minimum, standard operation. The 2 handlers from the dead-end marsh were no longer in the equation. The rear unit's hounds had the chemical contamination zone to navigate, which would slow but not stop them. He had, at the best estimate, 15 minutes before the captain's unit was within use range. He looked at the path ahead and saw the limestone shelf, not 40 minutes away. It was here, the path rising ahead of them as the root mat gave way to the first outcroppings of pale stone, the gray rock breaking through the swamp floor in irregular ledges, the water pulling back from the path edges as the elevation increased. He'd miscalculated the distance, or they'd moved faster than he'd tracked, or both. The shelf was here, and the path was rising under their feet, and the root mat was becoming rock, and the rock was becoming the unbroken limestone country of the swamp's edge. He stopped. She stopped beside him. He looked at the limestone shelf ahead, then back at the path behind them, where the captain's horn had just sounded again. 200 yards, maybe less, moving fast. The shelf was safe. The rock held no scent. If they reached it, the hounds were neutralized, and the captain had no leverage. If they reached it. He looked at the ground they were standing on. The transition zone. Root mat over the first limestone outcroppings, the mud still present in the gaps between the rock faces, still venting in the low patches where the organic substrate hadn't yet been displaced by the stone. He could see the vent bubbles in 2 places. Small, regular, sufficient. The last vial was the binding compound, acidic byproduct from water degradation. Possible exothermic secondary reaction on contact with organic material, same as the accelerant. He designed both compounds from the same base formula, adjusted for application. The accelerant for fast surface reaction, the binding compound for slow penetrating reaction. In degraded form, the distinction between them had probably collapsed. He looked at the vent points. He looked at his flint. She was watching him, not the path behind them. Him. The way she'd watched him at the reed stand, at the vent points, at every moment when the vials in his bandolier became the determining factor. "Same as before?" she said. It was not a question. "The rock shelf is 30 paces ahead," he said. "If I place this at the vent points, and we move simultaneously—" "You go first this time," she said. He looked at her. "Roka." "You go first," she said. "To the shelf. I hold the path until the spark." Her eyes were steady. "You cannot hold the path. I can. You place the catalyst. Go to the shelf. I hold them at the transition point until the moment before ignition. Then I follow." She looked at the vent points, reading the layout the way he'd watched her read terrain all night. Direct, practical, without drama. "You said 8 seconds from spark to detonation. At this substrate density, possibly 6. 6 is enough," she said. He looked at the rock shelf ahead. 30 paces of rising path, safe ground. Then he looked at the transition zone behind him and the path curving south where the captain was coming, and the specific geometry of the available space. The water on both sides, the limestone outcroppings channeling the path to a fixed width, the vent points distributed across the last 10 feet of route mat before the rock began. The catalyst placed at the deepest vent point, the flint mount on the staff driven in at an angle to create a delayed contact. The staff left standing in the mud, with the flint bearing against the limestone below. When the staff fell, flint hit stone, spark went down into the channel. He could set it to fall. The upright position of the staff was maintained by its own angle in the soft mud. Change the angle, reduce the margin, and the staff would fall when the mud at its base compressed under weight. The weight of something large, moving fast, running. The captain's hounds would knock it over themselves. He looked at her. She was already at the vent point, watching him, waiting for him to move. He went to his knees and uncorked the last vial. "When it's set," he said, working the binding compound into the deepest channel, "I'll tell you." From the shelf, he drove the staff into the mud at the calculated angle, 20 degrees off vertical, the flint mount oriented down, the mud depth at the base giving it a margin of maybe 40 seconds before its own weight brought it down, reduced to 6 seconds if something heavy passed within a foot of it. "The moment you hear me say now, you move. Do not wait to see the spark. Do not wait for the sound. You move when I say now, and you do not stop." She looked at the staff standing in the mud, reading the setup. She understood it. He could tell by the way her eyes moved across the components, tracing the logic from catalyst to channel to flint to fall. She understood it the way she'd understood the spore pod trap and the smoke screen and all of it. Not because she'd been taught this category of thinking, but because 10 years in a fighting pit had built in her a comprehensive working model of how things killed you. And that model was general enough to apply to new information quickly. "Go," she said. He went. 30 paces of rising path, route mat giving way to rock, his boots finding solid ground for the first time since before the cage and the water and the night. He reached the first limestone ledge and turned. She was standing at the transition point, 10 feet from the staff, iron bar in both hands. Behind her, coming around the path's southern curve at full pace, 3 hounds, the captain's unit, and behind them, a man he could see even from 30 paces was not a field handler. The captain was tall, and he moved like someone accustomed to being the last word in a situation. And he had a catchpole in one hand and a short blade in the other, and he was looking at Roka the way you look at something you own that has caused you a great deal of inconvenience. The hounds reached her first. She broke the first one's momentum with the bar, A single, flat strike that redirected the animal sideways off the path and into the water without injuring it. Efficient use of force, not more than the situation required. The second hound she sidestepped, letting it run past her and off the path edge on its own speed. The third she caught by the scruff with her free hand and set down on the root mat hard enough that it reassessed its priorities and sat. The captain slowed. He was looking at the standing staff. He was a man who had sent teams into this swamp and had gotten back the horn signal from neither of them. And he was looking at a staff standing in the mud at a specific angle near a bubbling vent point. And he was not stupid. He stopped, 4 feet from the staff. She looked at Vane on the shelf. He looked at the staff, at the captain, 4 feet from it. At the vent point, active, pulsing. "Now," he said. She ran. The captain lunged for the staff, to pull it, to remove the spark risk, and his boot came down 6 inches from the base, the root mat compressing under his weight, the mud at the staff's base compressing with it. The staff fell. The blast reached him as light first, a pale, flat brightness that came under the smoke before the smoke had time to form, washing the limestone shelf in one even, directionless illumination that lasted less than a second and left no shadow. Then the pressure, not a shock wave, not the sharp concussive impact of a powder charge, but the slow, total push of a gas detonation propagating through a substrate, arriving through the rock beneath his boots before it arrived through the air. His knees absorbed it. His back teeth registered it. The mangrove canopy above the transition zone shook once, leaves releasing in a brief collective flutter, and then settled. Then the smoke, dense and gray-white, the same color as the morning sky above it, rolling outward and upward from the transition zone in a column that spread horizontally when it hit the canopy and flattened into a ceiling. It moved northeast with the light morning air, thin at the edges, thick at the center, filling the path corridor from water edge to water edge and reducing the transition zone to a solid wall of opacity. He stood on the shelf and watched it and counted. 1. The smoke was still expanding, still dense, the transition zone fully opaque. 2. The distant sound of the swamp reasserting itself. Water, wind in the upper canopy, a bird somewhere to the east registering an objection to the disturbance. 3. The smoke beginning to thin at the upper edges where the morning air was moving. 4. He was aware of his own breathing, which was even, and his own hands, which were not shaking. Not from cold, not from anything. Still. 5. The limestone under his boots was solid and dry and smelled of mineral earth and nothing chemical, because the rock held no substrate for the agent to propagate into, and the blast had been contained entirely to the root mat side of the transition line. He was standing on ground that the explosion had not reached and could not reach. 6. She came out of the smoke at a full run. The smoke parted ahead of her, and she was through it and onto the limestone shelf in 2 strides, the iron bar still in her right hand, the chain at her collar swinging with the impact of her boots on solid rock. She ran past him 4 paces before she stopped, turning, facing the smoke wall. Neither of them spoke. He watched the smoke. She watched the smoke. It thinned. Slowly, the column losing density at the edges, the gray-white becoming gray, becoming transparent at the upper register, the canopy appearing through it piece by piece as the agent dispersed into the open air above the swamp. The morning light came through the thinning smoke in flat, directionless sheets, the kind of light that arrives before the sun is high enough to angle. The transition zone appeared. Empty root mat, scorched at the surface in the specific pattern of a distributed low-temperature detonation. Not burned, not charred, but darkened. the organic material of the root mat's surface heat-treated into a stiffened crust. The staff was gone. Consumed or displaced, he didn't know which, and it didn't matter. The vent points were sealed, the mud around them glassed smooth by the exothermic reaction. The methane venting ended. No movement on the path, no sound from the south. He looked at the root mat surface and found what he was looking for: the captain's boot prints, pressed deep into the mud at the path's edge. The last 2 steps before the transition zone, showing the compressed, forward-leaning impressions of a man who had been moving fast and stopped fast. The prints ended 4 feet from the transition zone's edge. The prints did not continue onto the scorched surface. He read that for a moment. Then he looked northeast. The limestone shelf rose ahead of them in a series of broad, pale ledges. Not steep, navigable without a staff. The rock surface rough-textured and dry, and absolutely, finally, solid. The path continued across it in a visible line, worn into the limestone by decades of animal traffic, leading northeast toward the swamp's edge where the free territories began. He could see 50 feet ahead, 100. No fog, no spore pods, no soft ground. He looked at his bandolier. Empty. Every slot, every compartment. The clay pot of blue moss compound in the outer section. He checked. Still there, half full, enough for 1 application. He left it where it was. She was still watching the smoke. Her breathing had returned to normal. It hadn't taken long, which told him what 10 years of sustained physical conditioning produced in recovery time. The iron bar hung at her side. The chain at her collar had a fresh kink in it from the run, the broken end swaying. He looked at the collar. "The cache is ahead," he said. 20 minutes on solid ground." She turned from the smoke and looked at him. The dried paste was mostly gone from her face. The blast's edge had taken the last of it on her left side. The rest flaked away during the run. The irritated band at her collar's lower edge was visible in the morning light, redder than it had been in the firelight, the sustained contact of the metal having worked further into the skin over the course of the night. She looked at the empty bandolier, then at the limestone path ahead, then back at the smoke, which was now thin enough that the root mat on the far side was visible, still empty, still silent. 20 minutes, she said. On this ground, at this pace, yes. She looked at the collar, then at him. The expression on her face was the one he'd been cataloging all night. The assessing look, the one that was perpetually revising its conclusions. It had a different quality now than it had at the cage, at the reed stand, at the leech extraction. It was not the look of someone deciding whether to trust an unknown quantity. It was the look of someone who had already decided and was now doing something else with the information. What that something else was, he couldn't entirely read. She didn't offer it. She turned northeast and started walking. He followed. The limestone was everything the root mat hadn't been. Firm underfoot, the surface rough enough for grip, the path wide and unambiguous, and lit by the growing morning in a way that made his good eye's job simple and his bad eye's absence irrelevant. He walked without a staff for the first time since leaving the laboratory, his hands free, the empty bandolier light across his chest. His boots were destroyed. The leather of both had absorbed so much of the Blackwater's chemical content overnight that the surface was permanently stained and the seams were already separating at the toe of the left one. He watched them as he walked and made a mental note about boot quality relative to swamp chemistry, which was the kind of note he made when he was processing something else. She walked 3 feet to his left, matching his pace exactly, not leading, not following, beside. They walked in silence for 10 minutes. The swamp receded behind them, not abruptly, but gradually, the water pulling back from the path edges as the elevation increased, the mangrove canopy thinning and then opening, the blue-green glow of the spore pods no longer visible, the mist gone entirely in the morning air above the rock. The sounds changed, too. The flat, damp acoustics of the swamp interior giving way to the slightly more resonant quality of open air over stone. A difference so subtle he wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't walked this transition a dozen times before. He found the cache by the marker he'd set 4 years ago. A specific limestone slab, shoulder height, with a horizontal crack at chest level that he'd filled with white clay on his second supply run. The clay was still there, intact, visible from 10 feet. He moved to the slab, crouched, and pressed his hands against the base where it met the shelf floor. The slab shifted. It was not fixed, had never been fixed, sat in a socket of its own weight in a slight depression in the shelf. He tilted it forward, and it came away from the wall behind it, revealing a dry cavity 2 feet deep and 3 wide, cut into the limestone face. She crouched beside him and looked at the cavity. He took inventory. 2 sealed clay pots, blue moss compound, refill quantity. 3 full sets of vial compounds in individual paper-wrapped bundles, each bundle containing the 6 core compounds he carried. 2 days of compressed food in waxed paper, a water flask, sealed, full, a folded oilskin with a spare flint and steel kit, a coil of thin, strong cord, a second staff, shorter than his primary, broken down into 2 sections and wrapped in cloth. He took the acid bundle first, unwrapped it, found the concentrated acid vial, set it to the side. Then he looked at the collar. She was already watching him. He held up the acid vial. Same compound as the cage lock. I'll apply it to the chain anchor point at the back. Same method. The collar ring itself is too close to your skin for the acid. I'll use the solvent on that. It will take longer. He looked at her. Hold still. She turned and presented the back of her neck. He worked carefully. The anchor point first, the small weld where the chain attached to the collar's rear loop. The acid dissolved it cleanly in 40 seconds, the chain falling away from the collar and landing on the limestone with a flat, metallic sound. He set the acid vial down and picked up the solvent, applying it to the collar's closure mechanism on the left side, the point where the 2 halves of the iron ring had been joined and sealed. The solvent was slower. He applied it in 3 passes, waiting between each for the compound to penetrate the metal surface, watching the closure point lose its integrity layer by layer. She held still the entire time. Not rigidly, the controlled stillness of someone at rest, breathing normally, not braced. The difference between that and the controlled stillness of the leech extraction was small but present. At the leech extraction, she had been still because she needed to be. Here, she was still because she had chosen to be. The closure gave. He caught the collar as it separated and took it away from her neck, setting it on the limestone beside the fallen chain. She reached up and touched the skin at her neck where the collar had been. Not rubbing, just contact. One hand flat against the area, feeling the absence of the metal. She held her hand there for a moment. He looked at the skin. The irritated band had sharpened in the morning light, the sustained pressure having left a clear line around her neck that would take several days to fully fade. He opened the blue moss compound without being asked and applied it to the band in a single, careful pass. She let him. When he was done, she lowered her hand and looked at the collar on the limestone, at the chain beside it, at the weld point he'd dissolved. She picked up the chain, not the collar, just the chain, and held it for a moment, the broken end where the anchor had been, the links turning in her fingers. Then she set it back down on the rock and left it there. He began restocking the bandolier, slotting each vial in its correct position by shape and weight. The familiar process of it, the small, precise work of known compounds in known slots, was settling in a way he hadn't known he needed until right now. He worked through all 12 slots, checked each seal, confirmed each compound by feel. When he finished, the bandolier sat on his chest at its proper weight, and the empty feeling was gone. He looked up. She was sitting on the limestone shelf with her back against the cache slab, her legs extended, the iron bar resting across her knees. The morning was fully arrived now. Actual sunlight, angled and pale, falling across the shelf in long, flat bands between the shadow of the thinning canopy. It caught the green-gray of her skin and the pale lines of the blade-block scars on her forearms and the place on her neck where the collar had been. She was looking at the free territories ahead. The limestone shelf continued northeast, and beyond its edge, visible in the clear morning air, the tree line of ordinary forest, not swamp, not the Blackwater, but regular woodland growing on ordinary soil, the kind of forest you could walk through without testing the ground before every step. He sat down beside her, not close, not far. The companionable distance of two people who had spent a night in the same foxhole and were now sitting in the first real silence that wasn't loaded with immediate threat. He felt the limestone cold through his ruined trousers and didn't move. Neither of them spoke for a while. From the south, somewhere deep in the Blackwater, a hound called once. Distant, not directional, not running a line. A single, uncertain note. The sound of an animal that had lost its track and was announcing the fact to the empty swamp. It did not come again. They sat on the limestone shelf until the sun was fully above the canopy. Not because they needed to rest. They needed to rest, both of them, but that wasn't why they stayed. They stayed because the morning was doing something that neither of them had experienced recently enough that it had stopped being noticeable, which was simply existing without immediate consequence. The sunlight moved across the shelf in its slow, flat bands. The canopy above the swamp's edge filtered it into shifting patterns on the pale rock. The air was cool and carried nothing chemical, nothing threatening, just the ordinary smell of wet stone and morning forest and the distant, neutral presence of the Blackwater behind them, diminished now to background. He ate. The compressed food from the cache was not good. Dense, dry, pressed into blocks that required sustained chewing and produced a flavor that he had charitably described in his supply notes as adequate. He ate 2 blocks and drank half the water flask and felt the calories move through him in a slow, stabilizing wave. His shoulder from the limestone wall impact had stiffened during the walk to the cache. He could feel the restricted arc now, the bruised tissue objecting to specific angles. He rotated it carefully and left it alone. She ate 1 block, looked at it, ate the second one without expression. He offered the water flask. She took it and drank 3 measured pulls and handed it back. He recapped it and placed it in the inner compartment of the bandelier's supply section, next to the refilled vial set. The weight of the fully stocked bandolier was comfortable, known, familiar, the right kind of weight. She was looking at the forest ahead. He looked at it too. The tree line was perhaps 400 paces from where the limestone shelf ended. Not a sharp boundary, but a gradual one, the rock giving way to thin soil, and then thicker soil, and then the first trees, ordinary birch and pine growing straight and uncomplicated in ground that held them without argument. The free territories began at the tree line. Not formally. There was no marker, no wall, no document. But the slaver operations that used the Blackwater routes as their southern corridor did not extend past the swamp's edge. The terrain made it impractical, and the law, such as it was in this part of the world, made it inadvisable. Past the tree line, a woman without a collar was not a product with a missing invoice. She was a person in a forest. "The forest path northeast," he said, "follows the limestone shelf edge for about 3 kilometers, then turns into the lowland. There's a settlement at the lowland's far end, Kara's Ford. It's not large, but it's established. There are people there who are not involved in the salt trade or the pit circuit." She looked at the tree line. "You know it." "I've been there twice. For supplies that the swamp doesn't provide. He paused. They know me. I can vouch for your entry if the gatekeeper requires it, though the gatekeeper is old and mostly requires that you're not carrying a slaver's brand, which you're not. She was quiet. Her hand moved to her neck, not the place where the collar had been, but slightly above it, the skin that had been covered by the collar's upper edge. She pressed 2 fingers there and held them. Not a gesture of discomfort. Something else. After Kara's Ford, he said, there are orc settlements 2 days northeast. I don't know them personally, but I know the routes. If you want a guide as far as the first settlement, I can do that. If you want to go alone from the forest path, that's also— Why? She said. He stopped. She turned from the tree line and looked at him. Not the assessing look, something more direct than that. The look of someone who has decided that an indirect approach to a specific question is costing more than it's worth. Why did you go into the water? She said. At the cage. You saw what I was. You knew what the collar meant. A pit fighter. A berserker-class slave. Her jaw set slightly. You knew the risk of releasing me, and you went into the water anyway, with your acid and your staff and your shaking hands. She held his gaze. Why? He thought about this. Not the answer. He knew the answer. He was thinking about how to say it in a way that was accurate rather than large. He had a professional objection to statements that were larger than the evidence they were based on. The cage was sinking, he said. There was a person in it. She waited. That was clearly not the complete answer, and she knew it. I've been disgraced, he said. I had a laboratory, and a position, and a research designation, and I lost all 3 in one afternoon when an experiment failed in a way that took most of my left eye's function and most of my colleagues' trust simultaneously. He looked at the bandolier. At the 12 slots, the vials in them, the 4 years of rebuilding a functional practice out of available materials in a laboratory next to a toxic swamp. I know what it is to be put somewhere and told, that's where you belong now. I know what it is to have people decide what you're worth based on what you cost them. He paused. The cage was sinking. That was the immediate reason. The rest of it was present, but secondary. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without qualification, which was easier than it might have been 24 hours ago, before a night that had covered a great deal of conversational ground without using many words. Your hands were shaking, she said. At the cage. You could see only half of what was in front of you. You went into the blackwater mud past your boots and nearly went under twice before you reached me. The flat tone carried something in it that was not flatness, a density that lived underneath the surface delivery, the way the methane had lived underneath the mud. You freed a berserker-class pit fighter from a deep mine iron cage with 2 vials of acid and a wooden stick. He considered this summary. The staff is iron-tipped, he said. She made the sound, the low exhale through the nose that he had catalogued all night. But this time it went further than it had before. It extended slightly past its usual duration and took on a different quality at the end, one he didn't have a precise category for, except that it was warmer than its predecessors. Not quite a laugh, not a laugh. She looked at the forest. He looked at the forest. The sun had moved enough that the shadow of the canopy's edge was receding across the limestone shelf, the warm light advancing toward where they sat in a slow, unhurried line. The black water behind them was quiet. No horns, no hounds. The morning had the quality of something that had decided to be ordinary and was committed to it. He became aware that she had not answered his offer. The guide question, whether she wanted company to the first orc settlement or preferred to go alone from the forest path. He had made the offer, and she had redirected to the why question, and he had answered it, and she had not returned to the choice. He considered raising it again and decided against it. She would return to it when she was ready. She was not a person who lost track of open questions. After a while, she reached into the inner fold of her clothing and produced the small square of cloth. Her last dry cloth, the one she'd handed him for the leech extraction. She looked at it, both sides, the way you look at something you've kept when keeping it required a decision. The cloth was damp now. Everything was damp after a night in the Blackwater. But it had been dry when she gave it to him, and dry cloth in the Blackwater was the currency of care. And she had spent it voluntarily, and she had kept the cloth after he returned it. She folded it once and returned it to her clothing. He said nothing. Some things didn't need a response. Some things needed to simply be allowed to be what they were, without being named or expanded or made into a statement. The shadow line reached them. The sun was warm on his coat. The ruined, stained, permanently chemical-scented coat that had been soaked twice in toxic water and exposed to acid vapor and blast heat and was still, structurally, a coat. He felt the warmth on his shoulders and was aware of it as a specific, physical thing, because 24 hours ago he had been standing at a workbench measuring compounds and had not been particularly aware of the warmth or the lack of it. Awareness of that category of thing required, apparently, a certain prior quantity of cold. She stood. He looked up. She was on her feet on the limestone shelf, the iron bar secured through her belt, her eyes on the forest path northeast. Standing the way she stood everything, with the complete, settled weight of a person entirely present in their own body, no apology in the posture, no concession to the night they'd been through, or the collar-shaped absence at her throat, or the scars that the morning light made visible on her forearms. She looked down at him. He got to his feet. His left shoulder reminded him of the limestone wall. He acknowledged it and moved. They walked off the shelf together and onto the path northeast, the limestone giving way under their boots to thin soil, and then thicker soil, and then the first ordinary grass of the forest margin, the kind of grass that grew because the ground was good and asked for nothing in return. The tree line came to meet them. Birch trunks, pale and straight. Pine, dark and unhurried. The smell of ordinary forest in early morning, earth and resin, and the clean, simple absence of anything chemical. She slowed as they entered the first trees. Not a stop, a reduction in pace, the kind that happens when a body accustomed to constant alert begins to process the absence of immediate threat and doesn't entirely know what to do with the resulting space. He slowed with her without comment. They walked between the trees at the pace the morning seemed to require, which was slower than they'd moved all night and more appropriate. After a while, she said, without looking at him, "Kara's Ford." 2 hours, he said, "on this path." She nodded once. They kept walking. The forest was quiet around them, in the way that ordinary things are quiet. Not the loaded silence of the swamp, where quiet meant the temporary absence of something dangerous, but the simple quiet of a place that had nothing particular to communicate. Birds in the upper canopy, wind in the birch leaves, a sound like slow water. The path ahead clear and visible and going somewhere specific. He walked beside her, not behind, not ahead. The iron bar at her belt caught a band of morning light between two trees and held it for a moment. The rusted deep mine iron of the cage, the bar she'd snapped free with her hands when the water was at her chin, that she'd carried through the entire night without being asked to set it down. She hadn't set it down. He looked at the path ahead and kept walking. The trees accepted them without ceremony. The morning continued, ordinary and sufficient. The Blackwater was behind them, and the free territories were all around them, and Kara's ford was 2 hours northeast, and the path between here and there was solid ground. It was enough. For now, it was exactly enough.